Hello, everyone. Welcome to this show. I'm your host, Chris Martinson of Peak Prosperity. And today, really special guest for you. This is a gentleman who was just giving presentations at our yearly gathering here at our farm called Honey Badger Farm and the Honey Badger Gathering. He gave this really amazing talk, blew my mind. Had to have him on the show. We've got to talk about this more in public because you need to hear this. This is a really amazing set of ideas that are going to be shared here. So I'm really looking forward to a long form conversation. And I think you're going to really enjoy it. Now, we're talking with Alan Booker, who is the founder and executive director of the Institute of Integrated Regenerative Design, which trains professional design practitioners to create systems. I love systems that are ecosystemic, biocompatible, and regenerative. We're going to find out what those words actually mean because how we define those is really important. Alan, so great to be talking with you here again today.
Oh, great to be here, and thanks for opening up the floor for the conversation.
Well, you know my work. I take the economy, energy, the environment, kind of a systems, a high enough level that people can see how the pieces touch. I put them in a spot, connect the dots, and say, this is highly unsustainable. I came at this really from an energy and an economic standpoint, with the third E, the environmental side, really being, well, you know, I can tell you about resources as sort of a taking stuff out, putting stuff back in, pollution and all of this and that. That was the level I'd looked at it. You're coming at it from a complementary direction and looking at the same things. And when you scan the world with your view, what's your high level sort of summary of where we're headed and what are our chances of having a long and happy and durable future as a species?
Boy, that's a complicated question just to start out with. But I mean, I think what was interesting was when I first ran across what you were doing, and as you were starting to put out the crash course, it was the same time I was beginning to teach workshops in my community that were framing some of the same issues through the lens of my engineering background. And so I started off with something I called 8 transitions that are changing the world. And so energy and fossil fuels was one of those 8. And others included, I won't go through all of them in detail, but others included water resources. Soil and agriculture was one of them, and that is huge and is continuing to unfold. Climate adaptation was one of them. And boy, there's a lot more to that. And I frame it differently than most people are probably gonna think. And then of course, other issues included population demographics, economics, and geopolitical changes having to do with the cyclical changes that are being driven by all of the underlying resource constraints and energy constraints we're running into. And so about that same time, I was contemplating it and framing it as these are 8 transitions. And I think one of the first things I would say about this is that when I first started teaching this, I realized that there were people that would show up and they would kind of hear what I had to say. And if I weren't careful, they would go into almost like existential crisis. Mm. And the reason was that they had internalized a narrative that authors like John Michael Greer have called a narrative of progress, right? And the internalized narrative they had was that, humans started in the caves and would go in like a monotonically increasing sequence of advances towards the stars, and we would inherit the stars and so forth, and that this is the way the world works. And so that is, let me point out something very, very interesting about that. That is a linear narrative. It has, when I've talked to people about storytelling, they say, well, a story is a thing that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. That's the most basic idea of a story. And I'm like, that's a Western definition of story, because a lot of indigenous stories that I've worked with are cyclical stories, right? They have cycles. And so this idea of a beginning, a middle, and an end is a different kind of storytelling. than the idea of cycles. Also, interestingly, a lot of Western storytelling is I-based. It's like a story of me, not a story of we. So, and so what I was noticing was basically this. You had people coming in the door who had this narrative of, we'll always be able to fix it. Technology will save us. It's just going to be, whatever the problem is, we'll figure it out. And then as soon as you started to systematically address that and show them that there were major issues that we were going to have to face, that we were going to have to transition through, and that this narrative of progress that they had internalized was not going to make sense of what was going on right now, then what was interesting was that they would go for the anti-narrative. That is, they would swing from one extreme of the pendulum to the other extreme of the pendulum, which is, well, if the linear narrative of inheriting the stars is not true, then obviously the only other possible narrative is the narrative of apocalypse. That it's all going to fall apart, we're all going to die, that sort of thing, right? And so it took me a little bit to realize this is what people were doing, that this is why they were having this existential crisis. And so I basically said, a lot of the narratives you hear of the apocalypse, a lot of the storytelling is around the idea that something happens and that humans simply don't adapt, that they just simply let it unfold, and there's never an adaptation step, right? And so I was like, go back and look at history. Number one, history is cyclical. And number two is that almost always, if you go in and look at it, what ends up happening is in what I call the messy middle, right? So when I would do this, I would come to the end of laying out all this stuff, and they say, well, what's going to happen? Tell us what's going to happen. And I would say, that question is the wrong question, because we're working in a complex system and it's impossible for me to tell you what's going to happen. Here's what I can do. I can lay out a range of scenarios, and we'll lay out a scenario from the most optimistic to the most pessimistic, right? From the scenario that, yep, technology will magically save us, all the way down to, yes, it's the apocalypse and everything falls apart and the species goes extinct, or whatever you want to say. Let's lay out all these different scenarios. And then usefully, what we can do is we can try assigning broad probability ranges to those scenarios. And when you do that, the extreme scenarios on the end have lower probabilities, and the probabilities in the middle, the messy middle scenarios, have higher probabilities. And so we go through that whole exercise, and at the end, they're still kind of looking at it going, yeah, okay, we got all that, but no. Give us the inside, like what's really going to happen, right? Like obvious, like, okay, so you may tell you what's really going to happen? They're like, yeah. I said, all of them and none of them. And they're like, what does that mean? Well, first of all, none of them. The scenarios we laid out, it's not going to happen exactly like that. These are all scenarios that are indicative of different trends that could emerge, right? And so, yeah, probably we're going to get elements of all of those. That's the way reality normally works. We're going to get some things that fall apart and cause, large problems. At the same moment, we're going to have some surprise technological breakthroughs that change things. And then we're going to have all this adaptation going on. And that's going to include, the sorts of things that people used to understand was normal, which was massive geopolitical shifts over time. As the centers of geopolitical power and economic power would shift and emerge and so forth. And you go back and look at the cycles of world history talked about by Toynbee and those kinds of scholars, and it's exactly what you expect, right? So what I basically have to explain is that, for those of us who are about, in my age group, which I'm not quite old enough to be a boomer, but I'm older Gen X. We lived in a period, if we lived in the United States, of basically amazing stability in terms of geopolitics and everything else. We were in a period of growth that was largely uninterrupted, except from some small cyclical things that happened. And so we got into normalcy bias, that this is the way the world works, right? And now that some sort of changes are upon us, the reaction oftentimes is to go, well, if it isn't progress, it must be catastrophe. And my message has always been, no, it's going to be this very complex set of adaptations. The complexity of it is that where we are at the moment is that there are power structures and incentive structures in place on the globe that have a lot of vested interest in maintaining certain structures at status quo. And therefore, they are attempting to retard the rate of adaptation because that adaptation challenges their power structures. And the longer they're successful in retarding the effort to adapt, the more abrupt and the more disruptive the adaptations will have to be when they finally get here. And what we've been doing is using the extremely high energy density of fossil fuels to allow us to drive the system into a regime of systems behavior that would not be possible if we were not artificially driving it with that high amount of energy. And the moment that high density of energy becomes less available, whether it may be because of physical difficulty in extracting it or because it becomes economically unviable to do so, then the ability for the power structures to continue to retard the process of adaptation that begins to fall apart. And then you're going to have that conflict between the people who are trying to adapt to a new emerging reality and the people who have vested power interests in the old regime who are defending their power structures.
Now, a lot of great thoughts in there. So let's take two pieces of that. First, complex systems. It's a really important thing. I remember when my mind was blown. I remember the day I was reading a book called Origin of Wealth by an economist called Eric Beinhocker, just brilliant. And he talked about this. If I was trying to understand economics, so I'm reading everything I can about wealth, and he said, oh, there was this really funny thing that happened. The first Santa Fe Institute, I think it was 1984, where they bring in all the experts. They got PhDs and Nobels from chemistry, physics, astrophysics, economics. They bring all these people together thinking, we should have some of this interdisciplinary, let's start sharing what we know, right? Everybody sort of unveiling their wares. And the economists came forward and said, oh, here's how we look at the world. And the physics people were like, you're using closed form equations that Walrus in 94 and came up with in Poland, right?
Yeah.
It had second law of thermodynamics hadn't even been invented yet. And economics is over here clinging to this model that said it's really messy, but if we could just model the world the way we want it to be, it's a closed form system. And of course it isn't, right? And it's an open system and it's a complex system and it owes its order and complexity to the energy flowing through it, right?
Yes.
And right. So while economics is busy building up its dogma about how the world works, it was ignoring the role of energy in allowing all this beautiful, wonderful complexity to develop. So that maybe you have to go and study complexity theories, like what's happening here. And so there's that first piece: complex systems owe their order and their complexity to the flow of energy, right?
Right.
And the second big feature we got to get out of that is that they don't have predictable behaviors. They have emergent behaviors.
Yes.
Those two sets of ideas really had a huge impact on how I see the world.
Yes. There's so much in there. I think one of the first things to point out is, like, when I'm talking about economics, one of the first things I point out is go back to those origins of the modern economic theory in the 17 and 1800s. And at that moment, there was a set of simplifying assumptions made in order to allow for the quote unquote science of economics to move forward. And there were some simplifying assumptions about using closed form equations. There was no complexity science. Complexity science really emerged in the 20th century, and actually in the second half of the 20th century, really. And the second thing was that one of the simplifying assumptions was that how do you model Earth's resources, right? And that's a very difficult question in the 17 and 1800s. How do you model Earth's resources? And so they made a decision which was effective for the moment, but would have profound implications. It was like, okay, well, what we're going to do is, since we're using a relatively small percentage of the Earth's natural resources, and the waste that we're producing is fairly insignificant compared to the capacity of the ecosystem to absorb it, then what we do is we model the Earth's ecosystem as an infinite source of resources and an infinite sink for waste. Mm-hmm. And so, it's like, okay, well, if you're in the 1700s and you're trying to figure out how to, create a system of economics, then at that moment, it is an effective way of going about it. But the whole problem was, at that same moment, they were making another assumption, which was that if we could recruit a higher percentage of natural resources from the ecosystems of the planet to the project of human civilization, then we could raise the standard of living of everybody. And they were making statements like the rising tide will raise all boats and so forth, the whole idea, because there were some folks that were really thinking about the philosophy of economics back then, and they were seriously contemplating, how do we make life better for everyone? And so there was this somewhat turned out to be fairly naive idea that if we could just simply recruit more and more of the Earth's resources to the project of human civilization, everybody would have a better life. And so the system that they created did two things that, when you combine them, have an emergent effect that's becoming fatal now. One was model Earth's ecosystem as an infinite source of resources and an infinite sink of waste. And the second was to create a system predicated upon exponential growth and therefore predicated upon debt. Debt makes sense when you think the future is going to be better than the present, because your ability to repay in the future is better. And so it was like, okay, we can build this system. We know that the process we're going to do is to extract an increasing amount of Earth's resources, and therefore things will be better. And therefore, in order to get the whole party started, what we're going to do is we're going to borrow against the future that's going to be better. And the whole system, the way it was created for monotonic exponential growth. Its system based upon debt, in which the interest on the debt is not created when the principal is created, basically dooms you to exponential growth of your economic system, regardless of whether you can keep the underlying goods and services that are being developed out of the Earth's natural resources growing at the same rate. And for a long time, that simplification was adequate. You could get by with it. It was, but if you looked at the trajectory of where you were going to go, you knew at some point in time that on a finite planet, that there would have to be a divergence between what was happening on paper in the economy and what was happening in real life. And really, when we started to see that, was most strongly was in the early 2000s, where all of a sudden, the second derivative of a lot of growth started to go negative. Now, what that basically means is, if the exponential curve is like this, growth, the first derivative is positive, the second derivative is positive, you get exponential growth. When the second derivative turns negative, you're still growing, but the rate of acceleration of growth is now slowing down, right? So you're still growing, but the second derivative of the economic growth didn't turn negative. So now, on paper, you're having to grow the economy at the same exponential rate, while the underlying goods and services are diverging. And the further those diverge, the more you have to undertake to game the system to keep it actually running. And really, the question to me has always been, how long can you game the system? At first, I was a little surprised by how effective they've been at gaming the system, until I realized that basically they're willing to game the system any which way they have to. And I think the only stop on this is going to be when people's credibility and credulity finally reaches its limit. And so, to me, at this moment, if you ask me, like, well, what's the paper limit on growth on the economy? I think they'll just keep on pushing it and pushing it and pushing it until they literally reach the limit at which faith in the system breaks down. And so I think what's going to happen is we're going to run into a moment of correction, which is basically psychologically driven. When a critical number of people lose faith, but they see that the economic system and the underlying goods and services now bear no relationship to each other, and therefore the economic system is, well, what it always has been, which is a machine that will drive economic growth, until forever if we don't change it. And so I think at that moment when we're going to start seeing there have to be a correction, and we're going to have to change to an overall overarching economic system that allows for growth and contraction and steady state. It would have to be a regenerative economy, because in a regenerative system, this comes back to the second thought you had, which is the complexity of a system is dependent upon the amount of energy flow available to the system. At a higher level of energy flow, you can sustain a higher level of complexity in a system. But a regenerative system, when the energy flow through the system reduces, it actually reduces its complexity and it finds a new equilibrium.
Mm-hmm.
The new equilibrium would be at a level of complexity that can be sustained by the level of new energy flow. And so nature does this. Nature is an expert at this. But the economic system that we have created has no methodology, no mechanism for doing such a thing. And so to me, if you ask the question about, what would a successor economic system have to look like, there's a couple of things you would have to say. Number one is it has to actually model Earth's resources as the primary source of wealth, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because right now it's like we work with people who are like advanced, like forestry, like some of the best foresters in the world, and they basically say, look, I can't put a value on that forest, so I cut it down and turn it into board feet of lumber, right? There's no economic way for me to model the value of that forest except cut it down and turn it into board feet of lumber, okay? In other words, nail it down and make it dead. There's no way of evaluating life and the true regenerative power of life. There's only ways of valuing dead assets that we have extracted from life, okay? So yeah, you get to that point where you're going to have to be able to model a new next generation regenerative economics as the primary economy is the natural ecosystem and its ability to produce and regenerate wealth. And that it will also have to be one that understands the variability of resource flow and allows for a dynamic adaptation to the amount of resource flow that's available. Therefore, it can expand, contract, and also deal with relative steady state over time.
Now, I mean, I love this idea, and I love the way you've put all this. Obviously, I'm very sympathetic to this idea of infinite exponential growth on a finite planet is a bad idea. And I'm intrigued with the way that these bad ideas sort of got developed and enshrined and became sclerotic a long time ago when they made sense. When they said, "Hey, debt-based money makes a lot of sense."
Mm-hmm.
Well, that was in the 1700s through the early 1800s, and it really got enshrined in 1913 in this country as an operative thing, right? Listen, 1913, still parts of the world we hadn't been to yet. This idea of space exploration was unknown. We hadn't even really begun to tap oil deposits yet. I mean, those probably made sense. I don't know that I would have made a different decision faced with those inputs back then. But the question is, does the system have the ability to self-reflect and adjust over time? And since I put out the crash course in 2008, Alan, the answer to that is a resounding no.
Right. Yep.
I've only watched that gap between the exponential. So debt is now accumulating at more than 4 times the rate of the underlying economic growth, because that economic growth is that second derivative. It's been flatlining out. Yes. We used to get 4 or 5% real GDP back in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and that became 3%. Since 2000, it's been about 1.5%. It's just like the response is, well, then we need more debt to create the appearance of more activity, because that's what we need. Without anybody going, how's this working?
Yeah.
Let's can we just have a timeout and just, have an honest discussion? And I've gotten into these exact arguments whenever I can. If they will have these arguments with me, I will talk to economists and I'll ask them about this. I understand what you're saying, sir, but it seems to me that you're talking about infinite growth. Can you explain how this works to me in your own language? And they just have these assumptions that they just can't go there because it's a complete breakdown of the orthodoxy, right? Which goes right to the root level equations, that they have. And they're not quite, it's hard. It's a hard conversation to have.
It is. And they start to mumble things about substitutionality and things like this. And, as sort of mantras to try to hold off the argument. And, but, I keep on running into this thing. I think if I'm hearing the question behind the question that I think you're getting towards, which is, we do in engineering what's called root cause analysis, right? In other words, a bad habit for beginning engineers is to attempt to address symptoms instead of root causes. And of course, that's because they're human beings, and human beings have a tendency to do that in almost all situations, right? Because the symptom is typically glaringly obvious, and it's like, well, there it is, it's right in your face. Therefore, we need to address that, right? And I've had this whole thing, by the way, when we talk about climate change, and I've been asked to address climate change a lot because of my background. And the first thing I basically tell them is that, if you had a deep infection and you went to the doctor and the doctor was fixated on the fever that you had because of the deep infection and refused to talk about anything else besides the fever, you need to go find a different doctor, right? Because yes, maybe if the fever is way out of hand, it needs to be managed, but the fever is a symptom that's being caused by something much deeper. And what you need is a doctor who's going to do root cause analysis and go, oh, well, yeah, there's this infection that has to be addressed in order to, to resolve all the other symptoms. And so a lot of things like being stuck in an economic system that we can't get out of, that's going to run us into, into the weeds, all that sort of stuff. It's like, well, why do we get stuck there? Why can we not make the next step? And every time I would go from one of these 8 transitions, because economics was one of them, one of these 8 transitions is going to have to happen. And I would go backwards and backwards to root cause. I would come down to, oh, it's because the people who are running this whole thing are using a certain paradigm. They're basing what they're doing on a certain paradigm. Now, I want to go back and use the word paradigm very precisely. We were talking about this a little earlier. I'll pull the book out because it's I think this one, the Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn, where he kind of used the word paradigm the way we tend to use it today for the first time. And so the way I want to use the word paradigm is basically it's a collection of stories about how the world works. And when you put them all together, they create a coherent worldview, a coherent tool for what I want to call sense making, right? It's like you look at everything going on around you and you're like, how do I make sense of this? And then therefore be able to make decisions on how to go forward. So the thing is that human beings have a really big brain that takes a lot of energy. And so they take a lot of time to develop these paradigms, and it's very expensive to change them. And so it's built into us that once we have a paradigm that seems to function and keep us alive and let us, not die, today or tomorrow, that we tend to hold on to that until we have to change. So what you get into is you get into paradigm lock. Yeah.
I just to make sure I got my definitions right, because these sound an awful lot like what I call belief systems.
Yeah.
They're very expensive. I think it costs like too many watts of glucose for your brain to do the remodeling. So nature has said,
yes,
do that sparingly, if at all.
Yes.
Yes. Are we talking about the same thing potentially?
Pretty much. I think that like when I'm addressing this with usually teaching scientists, engineers, other design professionals how to get out of the pattern lock that they're in. Okay. I will use the word paradigm, and we can define it because we can go in and we can say, oh, well, science got locked into what's called the Newtonian Cartesian materialist reductionist paradigm back at the beginning of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment, and it's caused all of these things. And what's part of that paradigm? Well, it's this and this, and we can talk about the stories and the presuppositions and so forth that all go together to create a coherent worldview that modern Western science used to tell it how to go about inquiry into the nature of the universe, right? That's a paradigm. It is a belief system, but when I use the word belief, when we're using it here, the interesting thing is that we can almost say everybody has their unique belief system, but a paradigm oftentimes has been socialized so that you grow up being taught to accept a paradigm. So the scientific method paradigm is something that you're socialized into as you grow up, right? And so it ends up not being just a belief system of one human individual, but it turns out to be a coherent collection of stories shared by groups of individuals, which can become institutionalized. And once it becomes institutionalized, those institutions now basically have vested interest in protecting those. So I think maybe let's use the word belief system to refer to maybe what an individual person has, but paradigms are these things that emerge, and they're meta belief systems held onto by groups of people in institutions, which can then become ossified and fossilized and protected by vested interests, even when they are past their usefulness, right? So that's why I tend to do this. Another interesting thing is when you're talking to the kinds of folks that I end up having to talk to a lot, they're typically very smart folks, but everybody, being human beings, has a sort of automatic protection system against changes to their belief system. It takes a lot of energy to be willing, as you said, to allow for the remyelinization of all of the neurons up there to afford looking at the world through a new set of stories. And so if I start by talking about these externalized paradigms, because we can have a little bit of remove from that. I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm saying here's a way of thinking that has emerged. Here are the institutions that are protecting it. And here are the ramifications of that set of stories and narratives and so forth. And here is why they are no longer optimal ways of sense making and decision making. And here's the problems they're causing, right? So that's kind of why I've gone in that direction of talking about paradigms first, as like the layer. So we're going downward in root cause, and we've gone down to paradigms that get institutionalized and protected. That's one layer, but we have to keep on going in a minute.
All right. So the paradigm then, I like this because this potentially provides a more convenient way for me to start in the conversation, because when I go after belief systems, I understand that those are guarded at the deepest level, and they're guarded by emotional reactions and responses, right? If you have an opinion, you might guard that with facts. And even though it could be a contentious debate, right? Still the facts will prevail over time. But a belief system, it gets very psychological quickly. That suffers from backfire effect, where the more facts you bring, the worse and more entrenched the other side gets. They become emotional very, very quickly. And so to navigate a place where there's a belief system, it's hard. So I'll give you a discrete example. Back in the day when I was, talking about peak oil, and I still talk about it, by the way, that's coming back, right? Because to me, it's very simple, deductive logic, right? Here's a single oil well, and it has a depletion curve. And when I put a bunch of them together, they have a collective depletion curve. And when I put a whole bunch of them into a country, it has a depletion curve. Ergo, this is how what the world is going to be facing. It's a very simple thing. But I could show somebody start down that process and they start getting agitated. And so I show more graphs and they get more agitated. And we go on, and now we're all agitated and it's not working. it's because they might have a foundational belief under there, which is, oh, technology is going to solve that.
Right.
So I'm not actually discussing oil. I'm actually discussing technology, which is a belief system. As you mentioned, it might be the operative belief system of that monotonic progress always goes this way thing. But if we can extract that to the paradigm level, our paradigm is humans are clever. We always think of something, and here's all of our supporting data to suggest that no matter what happens, we'll think of something, right?
Right. Yes. Yeah. It's boy, there's like an hour-long conversation on why that whole thing of we'll think of something, how it works in people's brains, and why it is misleading, why it's deeply misleading. But I'll basically say this. It comes out, I've been an engineer for 35 years, and I've had to work on solving a lot of very complicated problems, and at one point, somebody kept on going back and back to this, well, I'll think of something. And, I got a little exasperated, which I shouldn't have, but I got a little exasperated and say, look, I'm an engineer with 35 years of experience working on all these problems. So I am a representative of the committee of they, right? I've been working on these things and thinking about these things, especially how to solve these problems for over 20 years and so forth. And what I'm going to tell you is that what you're doing is you're using examples of low-hanging fruit, problems that were easy for us to solve, in which we made a lot of progress very quickly. And then you're saying, well, because we made a lot of progress very quickly in that area, we can take that same thing over here to this other area. And I'm saying, well, look at the fundamental underlying rules of physics. This is a whole different category of problem that runs quickly into certain underlying laws of physics that make it way, way more intractable to create that level of advance. Okay? So it's like, oh, we landed on the moon, we can do anything. Well, no, we landed on the moon because it was actually a tractable problem. It was selected by scientists at a certain point during the Cold War. They said, we need a propaganda coup here. What are we going to do? Let's go to the moon because we can see a way to do that. It's a tractable problem. All of the individual problems to make that up are conquerable in a known time period if we put enough resources onto it. Okay, great. But then it's counterintuitive to certain people that something that looks big and complicated might be tractable, but there's other things that seem simpler that the rules and the laws of physics and chemistry actually make pretty dang hard. And so when you have somebody come to you and say the whole thing, oh, they'll figure something out, it's like, that is a rationalizing tool. And oftentimes what we find is people who want to think that they're logical and being reasonable and so forth, no, they live by a narrative. They use that narrative to make sense of the world. They use it to make decisions. And then when they need to come up with a reason for their decision, then they rationalize and they cherry pick data to back up their rationalization. This is where we get, confirmation bias and so on and so forth. This is a very straightforward, and boy, this takes a lot of effort as a human being to overcome, because our brains are really not yet well adapted to living in a system with this degree of external complexity in our technosphere.
It's changing at an exponential pace.
It's changing at an exponential pace, right? So when you hear somebody basically say, oh, we'll figure it out, it's like, that is a rationalization to allow for not examining an underlying story, an underlying paradigm, underlying story. And you have to ask the question, no, wait, is this a tractable problem or an intractable problem? And I know you said that you picked up the cell phone, like, oh, we can do these things, we can do anything. It's like same thing, right? Mm-hmm. It's it turns out that there are certain things. I mean, I did in my undergrad in electrical engineering back in the 1980s. I was working on computer architecture and artificial intelligence. I did some of the early work in back propagational training of neural networks and so forth. Some of the stuff that's been coming forward into creating the current, trends in they're calling artificial intelligence. And, and so you looked at that and you're like, oh, well, we happen to pick a couple really good problems to work on because they had a lot of runway. They had a lot of, stuff we could do. And therefore you can look at that and say, well, we improved this by this many orders of magnitude in this many years. And therefore we can improve anything this many order of magnitude in this many years. We just have to put our mind to it. And, that is just fundamentally disconnected from the underlying reality of physics and, and quantum mechanics and magnetism and all the sorts of things we know that underlie the reality of how the physical world works.
I have an example of that because somebody, people keep saying, oh, Moore's law. You keep forgetting about Moore's law, Chris. These transistors keep doubling over some period of time, right?
Yep.
And so our computer chips gets faster, and they're absolutely right. But then I was talking with an actual chip designer guy who works on the fab on the wafers, and he said, you know why we're not really pushing past 4 gigahertz right now? Because take the speed of light, calculate it. Now take the width of that chip. We're about at the speed of light. So all we can do is make our wires thinner, and we were at 7, then we're at 5 nanometers, then we're at 3, now we're pushing 2. Where do you go from there? So it's like we're trying to squeeze, like the big squeeze already happened, right?
Mm-hmm.
High density, transistors crammed together. That was step 1. Step 2, but he's like, we're running into these physical limits, but people just keep going, oh, but this is not just a law, it's a law, like gravity.
So one of the first things I worked on out of college was very high performance Unix servers, some of the most high performance that were available in the world. And what was interesting was we were still packaging them down into smaller and smaller packages. But as we were working on the chips, what you get down to is basically this. You realize that about a foot per nanosecond, and at 1 gigahertz, your clock is ticking every nanosecond, right? And so it's like you had to actually think of the clock ticking in your computer chip, not as an event, but as a wavefront propagating out from the clock circuit. So, right, it's like imagine this wave going out, right? And so you're trying to keep everything synchronized on this big chip. So you had to almost think about it as like, imagine you are, on this huge field as far as the eye can see, and you got somebody who's is sounding a metronome, click, click, but it takes a lot of time for that clock to get all the way out to the far edges of the field, and you're trying to keep everybody synchronized. Well, people on that edge of the field and that edge of the field, it's like, that's what we're getting into, right? So yeah, you get to a point where you get to about 4 gigahertz, and you're down to like a quarter of a nanosecond, and you're like, the speed of light in the chip is like, it's getting really tight. So you eventually run into these hard constraints in the laws of physics, right? Speed of light, things like this. And so the reason that Moore's law has basically fallen off, and we haven't talked about that very much, but we kind of fell off of Moore's law was because for a long time, you just kept on going smaller, 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 smaller. Now we're getting down to the point where the speed of light and quantum phenomena, we're now getting the wires so tiny that quantum phenomena are beginning to dominate, right? So now we're starting to hit the point where making those, exponential increases is increasingly difficult. And that's why you don't have 20 gigahertz processor in your PC now, right? Which if the clock rates had kept on going the way they were, you should be actually over that now. So there's reasons for this. And so we are running into these underlying physical realities, and the same thing you've talked about a lot with just extraction of fossil fuels. And the density of energy in fossil fuels and how ridiculously dense it is. And so we've had this ability to drive. And by the way, it's interesting. I talk a lot when I'm in the beginning with people about systems, but eventually we get past talking about systems and start talking about holons and holarchies. And the reason is that the term system, the way it's defined in current engineering parlance, is a materialist reductionist modality of thinking that does not actually embrace complexity science. So we get into this idea of holons. A holon is a unified whole. It's a collection of interrelationships, processes, and flows that create a unified whole. So what's interesting is that in systems, when I was taught to think in systems, we define the system by the elements that made the system up. So if you had a bicycle, you would have the frame and the handlebars and the wheels and the chain and the gearing and the brake system and so forth. And that's a system, right? And in a mechanistic system like that, or a mechanical system like that, it is simple, non-complex. Membership in the system is easy. This is part of the bicycle. That isn't part of the bicycle. And typically, there aren't emergent properties in the mechanical workings of the bicycle. Therefore, you can study the bicycle by taking it apart into its subassemblies, and at some point, by understanding all the subassemblies, you can understand how the bicycle works. Okay? The Cartesian Newtonian paradigm of science that I talked about, that came about at the beginning of the scientific revolution, assumed that all nature was that way, right? That all nature was like that bicycle. It's a mechanism. It's like a Swiss watch. You take it apart, study the subassemblies, and you could then, by doing that, you'll understand the behavior of the Swiss watch or the bicycle, right? And that was what drove this mechanistic reductionist worldview of scientific inquiry, and has ever since really the beginning of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. But then science came in the 20th century and tore every bit of that apart, and showed conclusively that nature does not work that way. It was part of the reason it was called the Newtonian Cartesian paradigm. Of course, Cartesian is after the Latinized name of René Descartes, but Newton was Isaac Newton, and he was the first one who wrote equations that we could look at and go, oh, these equations govern the heavenly spheres and things on Earth. So all of a sudden, philosophically, it was like, oh, we've created equations that explain everything. Maybe the whole universe is like this. Maybe the whole universe, because it's a very seductive idea, right? We can write a few simple equations that explain everything. We can take the universe apart into its constituent little billiard ball pieces that bounce around, right? That was almost like the beginning ideas of, of atomic chemistry and so forth. And by doing that, we can take it apart into smaller and smaller pieces, understand the pieces, and then ta-da, we understand everything. We master the universe. And then science in the 20th century started to pull that apart, first with quantum physics. And when I'm teaching this in detail, I go through all the scientific discoveries of the 20th century that completely pulled this worldview apart, and the rising of complexity theory that says, no, the world in its natural ecosystem is built of holons, which are defined by their interrelationships and patterns and flows. Like a forest is a holon, right? The forest is defined by the interrelationships, dynamics, and flows. We can't define a forest by its elements, because the elements are constantly coming and going. You got trees, actually germinating and coming in, and other trees dying. You got birds flying in and birds flying out. You got water flowing in, air blowing through, resources entering and leaving. That's a holon, right? And the reason you can come back 1,000 years from now and the forest is still there, even though there may not be one living element that's still there from 1,000 years ago, is because the pattern of interrelationships, flows, and interrelationships is still there. Therefore, the forest is still there, right? That's thinking in holons instead of thinking in systems. And as an engineer, I was trained to think in systems, not in holons, because systems are predictable and controllable. And therefore, what almost all engineers and other design professionals are trained to do is to yank resources out of the messy complexity of living holons and nail them down into dead, predictable systems. So engineering, architecture is a design discipline designed to destroy life and make it into predictable dead things.
Well, so if the prime paradigm that's maybe outlived its usefulness is this idea that it's the Newtonian world. It's just a bunch of little billiard balls. If I could just calculate them with enough precision, I can tell you exactly what's about to happen. And of course, we have tons of data now that say, no, that's not actually how it works at all.
How it works.
It's not, that's not how it works, right?
Yeah.
So then we have to come into some other point of view. Not to make this too topical, but one of the people who drives me absolutely bonkers with that line of thinking gone too far is Yuval Harari, the right-hand man of Klaus Schwab out of the WEF. And he's famous, he gets on there and he's like, oh, evolution is over. That was so then. We're in charge now. We will just rewrite the human software, and we'll make better decisions than nature did going forward. And you chuckle, I'm so dismissive as to be contemptuous of that point of view, because it doesn't conform with anything I can observe to say that's anything remotely within our capability set as humans to be able to understand that level of complexity.
What I would say is, having listened to him a little bit, is that that whole worldview is the last gasp of technocracy. Technocracy has proven itself to be a failure over and over again. And so what ends up happening, and by the way, technocracy is the technical term for humanized, centralized command and control, right? The idea that we can have centralized command and control, right? And that by centralizing command and control, it's the ultimate expression of this mechanistic reductionist worldview. Oh, well, if it's all just billiard balls bouncing around, and if we get enough information and enough control, we can finally make them behave. And the fact that we keep on failing at this must mean we don't have enough information and enough control. And when we finally get all these recalcitrant people to stop, objecting, we finally will have enough information and enough control. It's finally going to work, right? That is the ultimate technocratic idea that the WEF and everybody else is working out. And what I can tell you is everything we now know from 20th century science about how nature works is that not only will it not work, it is destined to fail spectacularly. And the more you try doing that, the worse your outcomes become, and that it is simply an expression of extreme hubris to believe that we can do what the technocrats claim they can do. It's actually antithetical to the entire way that nature works. Because if you look at it, after 4 billion years of research and development, not in a single place that I can find, we do this thing called bio-inspired design or biomimicry. We look at how natural ecosystems work to understand how they create structures, how they create processes, and so forth. And nowhere we look do we actually find a centralized command and control organism used to manage a complex system. That's never used. So it's like, well, after 4 billion years of trying, nature hasn't figured out how to do it. And here we are convinced we're going to. And the more I've studied this over decades, the more I'm convinced, no, of course we're not. So, like I said, it is, to me, the ultimate bit of rationalization around the failure of centralized command and control, that we now have a group built on the totalitarian idea of technocracy, which is to get everybody else to believe your story. That's how it becomes totalitarian, right? So it's instead of a dictatorship, it's totalitarian. We're using Matthias Desmet's, the definitions here, right? The way we create a totalitarian state under technocracy is to get everybody to believe our story, that centralized command and control is the way that we're going to solve these problems, and that the reason we haven't gotten there yet is because you haven't given us enough control and enough visibility of all the information we need. If you'll merely give up all your freedoms and all your privacy, that we'll finally be able to get there and we'll be able to solve all these problems, right? And where we are now is in the last gasp of that. Because now they are in the WEF and some of the associated organs of power around it are at the state of trying to gather their last bits of, of control, and complaining loudly that they're not being allowed to have 100%, authority over everything and 100% visibility to all information, and that this is the whole reason they're not able to solve the world's problems. Profound hubris. I've talked to and been able to have conversations with some of the smartest people, I think, alive on the planet right now. And none of them are smart enough for that. None. And it's because of the nature of the way the ecosystems and living things work. There's no such thing as one-size-fits-all solutions that can be figured out from a centralized command and control system and then distributed out as the solution. Doesn't work. Never works. So I think where we are is we're at this transition moment where we're having to fight the last gasp efforts of the technocratic system, and also the power structures that benefit from the technocracy being in place. We're fighting their last gasp efforts, and then when they finally let go, we're going to have a massive reorganization, which is going to be highly disruptive.
Very euphemistically said.
Yes.
I think it was probably last year. I remember I think somebody who encapsulated exactly the dynamic you're talking about, to echo off of the Matthias Desmet piece, was Jacinda Ardern. She's speaking to the UN, and she said, right, well, we have to control misinformation, because we want to combat climate change, right? And we can't fight climate change unless everybody's on board, right? It was just this idea that until everybody believes, we can't really make any progress. That's why it's been so hard. It's just, there's a couple holdouts over there screwing the whole project up, and it's such I have a hard time really understanding that worldview, because it doesn't comport with any of my observational experience sets of how things actually work. So it's been difficult.
Yeah, it's a narrative protection mechanism, right? It's like people get into cognitive dissonance when the world is not comporting to the predictions of their narratives. They have narratives that they're using in paradigms, but underneath remember, paradigms are collections of narratives, right? So you're using these narratives, these stories, to make sense of the world, and then all of a sudden you start to realize that here is what my story would suggest to be true, and here's what's actually happening. And they're not matching. As a matter of fact, they're radically diverging. And that creates a moment of cognitive dissonance. And that's very profoundly uncomfortable for human beings, because it's a moment in which you realize your sense-making apparatus is failing. Okay? So you have a couple of options in that moment. One, and the knee-jerk reaction method, is to protect your narrative. The other, of course, is to acknowledge that your narrative is failing, and that therefore you must now go find a new narrative that makes sense of what's happening, right? And so since we have this big brain that's our largest energy-taking organ in our body, one of our adaptations is to try to conserve energy and not have to think, so deeply. So our first knee-jerk reaction is to simply defend the narrative, right? It's served us in the past, defend that narrative, and so forth. And so when you see it failing, it's like you'll grasp at straws. You'll be like, oh, like I said, obviously the reason that it's not working is because we haven't done it enough yet, right? Even though the more you do it, the worse it gets. It's like it's because we haven't 100% committed to it. That's obviously why it's failing, right? And so I don't find it at all surprising when I hear people do that. I think that is actually a normal human reaction to cognitive dissonance, and that it only comes, you come to a point where the cognitive dissonance is so big that you've either got to just disconnect from reality, or you've got to let go of it. And I think I did this quote when we were at the Honey Badger gathering, which was a really profound little bit insight from, again, John Michael Greer, in one of his coming from some of his meditations upon narratives and how they operate, right? And in it, it's a three lines little saying, and it's like, knowing many stories is wisdom. Knowing no stories is ignorance. Knowing only one story is death. And the way he explains that is coming out of his meditation was basically this: knowing many stories, being able to move between stories, means that you are able to adapt as the universe around you is changing, which it does. You know, for the people who don't like that, sorry, that's the game. You're no way to change that. It's going to change. You have to adapt, right? So knowing many stories means that we can move to more productive and helpful stories as things change around us, right? And then knowing no stories is ignorance. But this is what John Michael Greer's observation was: if you know no stories, then you're probably going to look around and try to make sense of it. You're going to have to like actually use the information available to you to try to create a story that makes sense. Okay, so at least you have the possibility, if you know no stories, you may be ignorant, but at least you can start from primary, first principles, and you can try to figure it out, right? So maybe ignorant, but at least there's that. But if you only know one story and you cling on to that story, even when it becomes counterproductive, now it starts to become baggage. It starts to become a problem. And then you can get to the point where that story, if you refuse to let go of it, will be the death of you. So if you get people who get stuck into only one story because they have so much life energy and so much of their prestige and their social status is tied into that story, then they will literally go to their death before they will let go of that story.
So let me see if I can I'll do my own simplifying assumptions. Let's imagine for a moment we're going to hold two things constant. Somehow we magically freeze the number of humans on the planet. We'll call that 8.1 billion, just coasts for the next 100 years. And magically we can just 100 million barrels of oil per day can come out of the ground, and we'll hold that constant for the next 100 years.
Yes.
This is already a recipe for disaster.
Yes.
Because I can tell you that what's going to happen is that 100 million barrels coming out of the ground is not the same as 100 million from 10 years ago, and won't be the same as from 10 years from now, because we're taking the old tasty stuff with 100-to-1 returns, EROIs, energy return on energy invested, and we're slowly swapping that out. It's getting in a replacement cycle with shale oils, tar sands, you name it, right? And with things with energy returns of 5-to-1, 10-to-1. So we're slowly taking the net energy in the system and squeezing it over time. So that will mean is that our economic pie, instead of growing, which is where all of our institutions, our monetary systems, how the worlds work, our political understandings, our geopolitical realignments, all of our metaphors, paradigms, and understandings of how the world works won't operate in that new world. But we will have what you just said, which is very important, all these entrenched interests, which are people who are going to defend with their ego, their livelihoods, their reputations, whatever, all the things that humans defend rather vigorously, right? So in a world where I've just described, holding a constant, we're going to have this shrinking pie with people who keep the system, who are guaranteed or certain that their story of self is, I deserve more of that, not less of it. I want more of that pie. And this is just going to set up all the conflicts. This is why I see, one of the most important, Alan, one of the most important charts that just came out, JP Morgan's own commodity research bureau a couple of weeks back just said, scan the world. There's a shortfall in oil supply and demand that begins in 2026 and extends as far as the eye can see, right? And they just sort of throw that out there and say, isn't that curious? No, it's not curious. Practically every war in history is a resource war. And whether that war is fought kinetically or economically or in the war of ideas and information, whatever. But I'm convinced that if we don't get our minds around just that one facet right there, and we just carry all of our old metaphors, which are about war. Everything's war. We're a very warlike country. Everything's war. We fight everything. We have a war on poverty. We got a war on. So maybe you could talk about the importance of when you organize around war as your prime concept. what you get. But I'm very worried. My concern is that we seem to not have people in power. Our team elite, they went to Brown, they went to Princeton, they went to Harvard, they went to all these great places, but they somehow didn't get grounded in what we'll call biophysical reality.
Yes.
Just didn't happen. So I know you're more frontline on that than I am, but anyway.
So yeah,
there's a question in there.
Start by reframing something. I noticed, I think it was you talking to Brett Weinstein not too far ago, where he was talking about, well, hopefully we'll get, fusion energy or something, and that will save us. And I'm like, no, that will kill us faster. If you could wave your magic wand and we could have economically viable, infinite fusion energy available tomorrow, given where we're starting and the paradigms we're holding at the moment, that would actually kill us faster than anything else. Okay? There's actually a blessing that we're starting to go down the energy curve, because it's going to force us into certain realities. If you were to give me and all the other engineers and designy people that are creating the technosphere, which is the term I use for the totality of the technological civilization on the planet. If you were to give us an infinite energy supply tomorrow, you would basically give us the energy to continue the process of destroying the biosphere. We're already destroying it at an absolutely astonishing rate. If, as a matter of fact, some scientists that looked at this basically said if we continued to destroy biomass at the rate we're destroying biomass on the planet historically over the last couple thousand years, we would return the surface of Earth to thermodynamic equilibrium with outer space in less than 200 years. Okay? Now, when they said that, people were like, oh, that's impossible. Because I was like, no. Here's the thing to understand. Linear extrapolation, when we do it as engineers and scientists, is not prediction. We sometimes use it to show that continuing in a particular direction is not going to happen. So when I say, if we continue to do what we're doing, in 200 years, we would return Earth to thermodynamic equilibrium with outer space. In other words, we would completely sterilize the planet. Will that happen? No, it will not happen. I don't think humans have the capability right now to actually sterilize the planet. Life is too robust. But what it basically says is that I'll guarantee you that we're not going to keep on the same trajectory we are for 200 years, because the systems that we're using to support ourselves would collapse and we would all die well before that. So something is going to change, right? So that linear extrapolation tells us something. It doesn't tell us what is going to happen, it tells us what isn't going to happen. Okay? But here's the thing. We are using large amounts of energy, as I said, in the pursuit of degenerative technologies that take living resources, pull them out of the biosphere and nail them down and make them dead. And then create increasing amounts of waste. And we see, all the things we've talked about, like all the things like, shifting baseline, we're talking about the insects on the windshield. We've had that conversation before, about the collapse in mammal populations, the collapse in bird populations, the collapse, the sixth great extinction, so on and so forth. All of those are symptoms of a huge amount of energy being pumped through the technosphere to allow for an exponentially increasing rate of resource extraction and waste disposal into the biosphere, reducing the carrying capacity of the biosphere, both by destroying its primary means of production and by polluting it. Okay? And if we basically gave that death cult, because that's what we're trying to be in design engineering and so forth, we're trying to be a death cult. I'm sure I'm saying that to be provocative intentionally, by the way. Okay? If you gave infinite energy to a death cult, what do you think is going to happen?
Faster death?
Yes. Okay? So this is the fundamentals I'm coming into and broaching with these designers, professional designers. That's why I start The stuff we're talking about is about where I start with them. Talking about narratives, and I say, look, we have to start with metacognition. We have to think about how we're thinking about design, right? We can't just say, oh, we're going to do what we're doing a little bit better. Or I'm going to tell you what, everything I've seen so far that's been called sustainable and regenerative design is basically, I tell you what, it basically say to me, I look at it, so what you're telling me is we're going to basically kill everybody 20% slower, right? We have a theory on how to slow down the death cult a little bit, and we'll be a little bit less deathy, right? And
Heat
again,
pumps.
I'm being provocative intentionally because I want anybody who's listening to this who has, who is in that whole arena of working with technology and so forth to think about the fact that this is what we're doing. And it's like, again, when I do this in the long lectures, we actually break it down very systematically to show this. And I show rigorously, scientifically how we get there and so forth. It's a conversation that takes us a little while to unpack. Just the introduction is 90 minutes in and of itself, right? We go through all of that. And we show where it started in, ancient Greek thought and how it got systematized into the Cartesian Newtonian paradigm and the coming of the scientific revolution, and then how design science rolled out of that mechanistic reductionist worldview, how that came to the idea that everything we design must be predictable and controllable, and that living things aren't predictable and controllable, therefore don't do that. Instead, take the byproducts of living things and make them dead, predictable things, right? And then that's how we're going to make our technology, and we're going to recruit an ever-increasing amount of that to the project of supporting human civilization. Okay, stop and think for a little bit, sit down and meditate for a couple hours on what that means, right? And that you'll come to this conclusion that we're going to have to completely rechange. So I redefine what it means to design, I redefine what it means to, what technology actually even is, and so forth. And so I don't talk about sustainability the same way everybody else does anymore. I've redefined that word because I realized that the way we were defining the word actually is counterproductive. I look at holons and I say that holon or system, according to which way you want to look, what you're looking at, is either regenerating or it's degenerating. Okay. Sustainability to me is whether we can keep that, whether that system dynamic will be maintained over time. So what we need is we need to be generating technologies that are regenerative and sustainable. That is, that they, just like life, regenerates instead of degenerates, and that it's sustainable and that we can maintain that regenerative system dynamic over time.
So maybe an example of that might be a water wheel in a mill, right? So it regenerates because the rain falls, and then humans come together and they go, wow, that's energy there. And so the humans organize and get some productive energy flow back out of that system. There's a net positive for building a dam and reconstructing the water wheel and greasing its bearings on when necessary and doing all the things necessary to keep it going. But the regeneration is due to the fact that the waters keep falling, right?
Yes.
Because the sun is over there being the sun, driving the whole thing. And
the regeneration
so that whole system,
Yeah, the regeneration actually also has to do with the fact that there has to be a process around the water wheel to rebuild it as it comes apart. Because in and of itself, the water wheel is a degenerative element. Okay? One of the moments I've had in the 20-some years I've been thinking about this, I've had a number of aha moments, right? Reframing aha moments and so forth. And as you might imagine from like listening to some of the things, I go into and talk to scientists, engineers, and so forth, and this whole way of approaching things is a big reframing for a lot of them, right? And here was part of it. I've had to actually redefine a lot of terms. Part of them, by the way, I'll just throw this one out as a side note for anybody here who's like a biologist or whatever. We tend to try to classify matter as either biotic matter or abiotic matter, right? I don't know, Chris, you probably run into that concept. That this is biotic matter and this is abiotic matter. And I said, actually, those concepts, the way they're defined, are misleading. I had to actually define a third term called diabiotic matter. Okay. And diabiotic matter is, dio comes from the Greek prefix dio, meaning bound to. So diabiotic matter is bound to life, right? So I'll do this with you real quick, Chris, because you get the biology background. Okay, so what's considered to be the smallest unit of independent life?
A cell, I guess.
Cell, right? So inside of it is a cell alive? Well, I think we would all say, yes, a cell is alive. It's part of the whole thing. Okay, and then we go into the cell and we say the cell has material in it called cytoplasm, right? It's got cytoplasm and so forth. You have all these processes and things going on inside of it. And as a matter of fact, the most forward-looking definition of life is life as a process. It's a great book by Fritjof Capra called The Systems View of Life that if you haven't read, I would highly recommend. He's looking at how it only makes sense to talk about life as being a process, right? Because the way it regenerates is a process. All right. So then we get into multicellular, we get into, eukaryotic organisms, we get into multicellular eukaryotic organisms, and now we have what's called the extracellular matrix, right? This is the material between the cells. And this is a great question I've asked a biologist, right? PhD biologist. I say, is that alive or not? And then watch what they kind of like dicker with that. It's like plasma in the blood, is that alive or not? And it's like, right? Because it's like if I remove a cell from the body, we would still say that cell is alive until the process stops, right? But if I remove plasma from the body, that process isn't happening, right? So we would say that stuff in the extracellular matrix is part of a life process. We're going to call it alive because it's part of an overall life process, right? Now we go up to Gaia, which is a superorganism composed of all the living organisms on the planet. And now things like the air and the water and the soil are playing the same role that the extracellular matrix does in a living organism, like my blood plasma. Water on the Earth plays the same role for the global ecosphere that plasma does in my body. As a matter of fact, life cannot exist without it. Cannot exist without these intermediating media. And I call those intermediating media diabiotic matter, bound to life, right? The waters, the air, the soil, they're all diabiotic matter. We can't call them abiotic matter. It doesn't make any sense to me. As a thinking in terms of holons and flows and interrelationships doesn't make any sense. So I call it diabiotic matter. All right. So, you're looking at that and, that sort of reframes the way I think about things. And the moment I pulled this book, so I figure we might get to it. It's another really fascinating, a little geeky, but here you go. The Extended Organism, The Physiology of Animal-Built Structures by J. Scott Turner. He's a physiologist. And he said, and the picture on the front is really important. That is, of course, a termite mound from Africa. And this was a little one of those aha moments for me. I was like, what is the termite mound? Well, it's not living in and of itself. It's what he calls an external physiological organ. He said the more he looked at the termite mound, he said, I am, as a physiologist, I know what an organ is, like what the definition of an organ is for a living organism. Well, this is important, so that's why I'm unpacking it. I know what that is, and it says what the termite superorganism, the colony is a superorganism, and it decided that it's evolutionarily the way to make it forward was, instead of installing a thermoregulatory system in each individual termite, was to have the termite colony have a behavior of building a termite mound. And the mound is what he calls an external physiological organ. That is, it's the thermoregulatory organ of the termites. Therefore, it is an organ physiologically. So what happens is, if the termites leave, the organ will start to fall apart. It is degenerative in and of itself. It will start to fall apart. However, as long as the termites are there, they maintain it as a physiological organ required for them to maintain homeostasis and remain alive. And then all of a sudden I was like, aha. A lot of technologies humans are creating are external physiological organs for humans. A building that we build so we can, stay alive in an Alaska winter is the same kind of external physiological organ that a termite mound is to the termites, right? We're not the first ones to do this. And the only way to look at this is to say that, yes, animals build technologies, and then part of the overall process of life is that we maintain those external physiological organs. So there's two ways for us to have regenerative technologies identified so far. Number one is for us to create technologies that mimic life and that they are intrinsically regenerative, that they can do what life does. The other is that we can explicitly build technologies into life processes, acknowledging and understanding that they are external physiological organs, and therefore, what I'm telling architects these days is if you scope your building as a set of interrelated elements, like a building envelope and plumbing and electrical and so on and so forth, that's the scope of your building, it's degenerative, always will be, done. However, if you scope your building as a process in which the building is an external physiological organ of the community that inhabits it, your whole view of what a building is and how it operates is different. And now the regeneration of the building is part of the biological process that you are supporting. Therefore, the building can become part of a regenerative process, even if it by itself, left to its own devices, would degenerate, just like the termite mound would if the termites left. We can have regenerative technologies. And those are the two ways I figured out that we could have regenerative technologies. And so what we have to redo is we have to basically stop the death cult of pulling stuff out of being biotic or deobiotic, nailing it down into abiotic, and making it degenerative. And we have to actually rethink the way we go about creating technologies so that the technologies are either regenerative in and of themselves or part of a larger regenerative process that we design. There you go.
Do we have any examples of that?
We do not have examples of the first that I'm aware of yet. We have a lot of examples of the second, because what happened was many indigenous peoples were doing that, right? Many indigenous peoples were creating technologies that were using the ambient real-time energy flows. What started happening was when we got to the point where we could extract artificial energy above the ambient flows in the environment, it allowed for us to basically drive the system into a very weird state, which is where we are today, which is where we're using a lot of fossilized energy, a lot of fossilized sunlight, pulling it out of the ground and using that energy to be able to drive systems in a non-regenerative fashion, right? But you go looking at it, and part of it, like when we teach regenerative design, we go back to a lot of case studies about how people have historically worked with natural cycles to be able to create a very high standard of living using the ambient energy flows and working with nature instead of against it, because pulling resources out of nature and nailing them down and making them dead is working against nature. It's actually working against our own intrinsic nature, right? Because we are part of nature. So it's our own intrinsic characteristics is life, and therefore we're anti-life when we do that. And so what we're looking for going forward is recoupling that the way we think into life processes and thinking in a regenerative fashion. This is why when I start teaching designers, the first thing I say is we have to start with thinking about how you think about design. Because if you get stuck in the old paradigm, then you get stuck in the death cult. And the only way to get out of it is to realize that, so we got to do the work of digging our way out of the old paradigm, right? So paradigms rest on narratives. And I know at some point you're going to want to get to the fact that narratives rest on metaphors. So I don't know if when you want to go there, but that's another thing that's very foundational.
I absolutely want to get there. But first I want to sort of drive home a part because you mentioned the word. This is insects,
Yeah.
and I'm of an age where I remember that when we went on trips, is when I was a boy, my job every time we stopped for gas, if we were driving through the summer months, was to get out there and scrape the windshield off, and it was
Yep. Me
a
too.
melange of really, yeah, big smears, browns and yellows, and some of them you had to really scrub at, and there'd be wings on there and stuff. Um, and that's not people's experience now. And so I notice, Alan, when I tell people that, you see the light bulbs go off, usually people of my age or maybe just a little younger, but the very young people are like, what are you talking about?
They have
Right?
no
They
idea.
don't have that. Their baseline is shifted. They don't know what we're talking
Yes.
about.
Yep.
But it's always filled me with dread. And I sort of waggishly say one does not simply wipe out a 420 million year old food chain
Yeah.
without consequence. But I hadn't really had a way to put my finger on that. And then you talked about how our forests are becoming unhealthy potentially. Can you take us
Yes.
through that and confirm for people, is that your experience too? It's not just me over here with like a very aerodynamic car missing a lot of insects as I drive,
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think this is interesting because we had this conversation, and I know where you're going to reach back to, because there are so many different ways I could go into the whole conversation of why our forests are now basically dying slowly. Because there are so many interrelated processes at work that are stressing out our forests, right? But we happen to mention insects and forests. And I said, okay, let me just make that one connection, right? Like this is one connection. The way my brain now is thinking about and seeing these connections, having studied ecology and systems and and permaculture and so forth for a long time. It's like one of the things I see, just one, is basically this. We tell our farmers that when insects show up and want to eat their crops, that this is a big problem and they need to poison the insects. This is one of the reasons we're getting a collapse in insects, right? However, that is fundamentally wrong. The way I'm teaching farmers today is when the aphids show up to eat your crop, be thankful, because they're doing a critical ecological function. And so this is a whole thing, again, working with nature, not against it. So let's back up and think about this. When we see this, and this is based upon two things: ancient indigenous wisdom from shaman and medicine people I've worked with all over the world, and number two, cutting edge science. It's really interesting how many times I'm finding those two are now starting to line up. Really interesting, right? It's basically this. The insects have an ecological function, and it is to clear out, one of their functions is to clear out sick and diseased plant material from the ecosystem to make way for healthy plants. And so when the aphids show up in the farm field and try to eat all your crop, say, thank you. You are bringing me a message. My message is the crop that I am growing is so diseased and so weak that even aphids can come eat it. And by the way, aphids are the ones that are, how should I put this? They can only attack the worst, the sickest and the worst. Okay? And so what you see is that the healthier a plant is, the fewer insects can attack it. And so we get plants that can't even photosynthesize effectively and efficiently, and aphids come and take them out. Then we get up into plants where they can photosynthesize, but they can't do full protein expression. They don't have the nutrient, they're not healthy enough, they can't do full protein expression, and therefore there's a whole other category of insects that can still eat them, but will come and take them out. Then if they get to full protein expression, the next layer is they finally get to full lipid expression. They can produce all the fats they need. And by the way, when you go out and you see, there's certain plants that you can really see this. You go out and you look at the leaf. If it's super healthy, you'll get that really beautiful waxy coat on the leaf that you don't get if it's unhealthy. And when you get that, now you're going to see a whole other group of insects drop out. And you finally get to the point where the last thing that'll eat the plant is grasshoppers and locusts. And then if you get it healthy enough, they stop. As a matter of fact, the entomologists have been studying this, say that They are flying over, looking down. They can smell and sense the plant. They won't even land on it. They're like, I can't eat that. I'm not even going to bother landing. Okay. So the way that I've come to reframe this is to think, when you've got a garden full of aphids, then I love it. This was Dan Kittredge, I believe, from the Bionutrient Food Association, the first one to say this way. He said, you're growing insect food, not human food. Right? And that was another aha moment. I was like, yep, that makes perfect sense. You are growing plants that are so diseased and so weak that even the aphids are coming and taking them out, right? Like that. All right. Well, here's the problem. As we are destroying the insect populations in our forests, whose job it is to take out the weak, that is to epigenetically and genetically select next generations of plants that are healthiest and prevailing in situations, we're taking that whole natural selection process off the table. We are allowing for sick plants to continue to take up resources and we're also not driving epigenetically advantageous natural selection so that the next generation of plants is better adapted to emerging environmental conditions, right? So I see the fact that the insects, the foresters are like, oh, all the insects are coming and eating all our forests now. We're getting, the hemlock woolly adalgin, and we're getting the pine beetle, and we're getting, the emerald ash borer, and we're getting all these kinds of things. I'm like, they've always been there. They didn't just appear out of nowhere. They've always been there, but they've been in an ecological balance. They've been coming in and taking out the weakest of the hemlocks and the ash and so on and so forth. They've been taking out the weakest of those so that they're basically acting like a top predator does in an animal kingdom, right? We know that if you take the wolves out of basically helping to genetically select like a ruminant animal, like an elk or a deer, that the health of the population of that herd animal goes down because you're not getting that genetic selection. And the same thing happens with the insects and the plants, right? So there's just like one small little interconnection. And so we have taken the siloed view. The siloed view is I'm all about keeping trees alive, and therefore the emerald ash borer is the enemy. Well, of course, now it's become a problem because we've actually stressed the forest to the point where none of the ash trees are truly healthy anymore. And now the emerald ash borer is just having a field day taking them all out, right? So it's now become a problem because we drove it into such imbalance ecologically that now it's happening. So, but to declare war on the emerald ash borer and say it's a problem is fundamentally misunderstanding. I mean, yes, it has become a problem because it's now out of ecological context. But if we were thinking about this rationally, we'd realize that the reason that this is happening is because we have basically imbalanced ecosystems to the point where a natural function is running off the rails because of what we've done. And that is the way we have to look at these things. And it's like, that's a critical bit of reframing. It also is critically reframing when we get into regenerative agriculture and basically say I get cities, big cities. We've been talking to a couple of big cities about food security and food sovereignty, right? I've been talking to some of the folks that are working inside the departments looking at this. And I said, look, you got to reframe it. The problem we have today is that we're talking about food security and we're lumping two things together that shouldn't be lumped together. And so I've been talking about, it's what I call calorie security and the nutrient security. And the reason we talk about that is because our agricultural system has learned how to basically force sick plants to generate a lot of empty calories. And they feed it to you. So you get enough calories. As a matter of fact, you get more calories than you're supposed to have because your body is telling you it doesn't have what it needs yet. So you just have this impulse to keep on eating. It's part of the reason that for the first time in human history, we've actually hit the point where there are people that are clinically obese and clinically malnourished at the same moment. Way too many calories, no nutrient. They're into chronic degenerative diseases and everything else. So we've got to talk about people who, it's like, yep, they got calorie security in that they're getting all the calories they need plus some, but they are lacking nutrient security, because the way that food security as a term has been used is if they got enough calories, they're good. And we got to get rid of that thought. That is a highly destructive thought that allows for the propagation of chronic degenerative disease.
I love that reframing, and I realized that I do a lot of work with the FLCCC doctors, and they did a lot of the COVID work and all this and that, and they've since branched out and become a lot more sort of, I'll call, say, holistic integrative approach, which is to say, because here's some things that I learned. COVID taught me a lot, and one of them was just about the importance of vitamin D, for instance, right?
Yes.
And now I get it, and so now I take daily vitamin D, because I do not get enough sunlight in my life to make up for it. So I learned about that and learned about other things, and I realized slowly that that I actually I bought into the paradigm of my culture, which is this: if you want to be healthy, Chris, you're gonna have to work towards this thing you have to push towards. And you can attain it maybe briefly, and if you're very diligent, you can hang on to it. But you got to go to the gym, you're going to have to eat special way, you're going to have to go to the doctor, you're going to have all these interventions, but if you stop, sickness. So it's kind of like, wait a minute, sickness is the baseline, health is this thing I can get to if I'm diligent. And I realize that's upside down. That health is the baseline of any well-nourished organism, and that sickness is the departure. And that's what you're talking about with the aphid. So if I go into my garden, so I can tell you this story flat out. I did not do well with my tomatoes in my garden this year. I'm still working on getting that soil up the curve. But I had some volunteers in a compost pile that's 2 years old. And even though they were like lounging on the ground and getting splashed on, no blights, no fungus, they're just as green as can possibly be. The first light frost, they shrugged it off, right? And all the other ones, just the difference is amazing. But that's the baseline of that tomato plant, is to be growing in an environment where it looks like the ones in my compost pile. It's just couldn't be more obvious. So extrapolate the human condition, at least in the United States, with the standard American diet, is deeply unhealthy. And we've all been conditioned and paradigmized into thinking, well, that's just how it is,
So, boy, there's so many different directions. One of the things I'll point out, by the way, is I want to come back to this idea, I haven't surfaced it with you yet, of static habitat versus dynamic habitat. And I've started to present in professional conferences on this concept of static habitat versus dynamic habitat. And I want to come back to that in a second. But the other thing I want to just come into this whole idea of our food crops, and understand that now what we have is we have a genetic bottlenecking of our food crops. And the cultivars that we are propagating in industrial agriculture have been selected for a lot of reasons that have nothing to do with taste or with nutrient density. Number two is that the methodologies we're using to grow them actually pretty much guarantee that they will not be nutrient dense. And the third thing is that the cultivars that we are using have been selected to get rid of the complex flavors. And what it turns out is that the complex flavors are typically phytochemicals that we need. So you get a plant producing first photosynthesis, then its proteins, then its lipids, then what we call plant secondary metabolites. Okay. The most healthy plant for us to eat in terms of being able to maintain optimal health is one that can produce all of that, all up to plant secondary metabolites, because those plant secondary metabolites are medicine for us. And so what we've been doing is we've been selecting seed crops for our annual crop production that we are doing. Everything, tomatoes, cucumbers, lettuce, down the whole things in our grain crops, to get rid of the complex flavors, including the bitter notes and the sour notes, all those things that our ancestors used to eat. And so now what we want is, oftentimes we're going to select for a cultivar that is, if anything, a little sweet and otherwise fairly bland. And then that's what we're going to feed people. And so what we're basically doing is we've selected feed crops. So, and those plants, since they are not able, they've had their plant secondary metabolite expression bred out of them, they can't protect themselves. So they're incredibly difficult to grow. They require pampering. They require pesticides and herbicides and fungicides and all the other biocides in order to grow them. And we're doing all that and taking all that extra care in order to grow a plant that is actually nutrient deficient and not good for us. So I like Arthur Haynes, his thought on this. He said, I don't really want to eat a cultivar of a plant that requires that kind of cultivation. I want to eat cultivars of plants that are so robust that they can escape from my garden and live wild, because they have all of the life vitality and phytonutrients required to protect themselves, be fully healthy, and then when I eat that, then I get what I need, right? And as an herbalist that goes off and does wildcrafting and so forth, I know that. I go, wildcraft herbs from areas where they are growing, and the fact that they are having to actually grow in that setting and fully defend themselves from the insects and everything else means that they're much more powerful medicine. And that's something that we need to have to inform our whole way of thinking about our food system. You go buy an apple and it has no flavor except how sweet can they make it, right? And the real cultivars of apples we should be eating have actually very complex flavors. They have like bitter notes and sour notes and tangy notes and floral notes and all kinds of stuff. They're very complex. And of course, now we are like, oh, I'm going to go buy an organic Honeycrisp apple, which is like had everything except sugar bred out of it, right? Now, of course, it's like organic Honeycrisp apples are blastedly expensive, because trying to find biocides that are organically certified to keep them from being taken out by the insects that are trying to fix the problem of a Honeycrisp apple by getting it out of the environment, right? That's hard work. And so, of course, they're expensive, right? It's like, so we have to reframe the whole way we're thinking about this. But let me go back to static environment versus a dynamic environment. Super important.
Yes, please.
So there's this concept in biology, and I don't know whether you ran across and talked about hormesis very much, as part of understanding physiology and how living organisms maintain homeostasis, right? Hormesis basically is the word for a living organism's response to an appropriate level of challenge or stimulus. And for people who aren't familiar with the concept, I always start with weightlifting because it's the one everybody can wrap their head around really, really easily, right? Because weightlifting is like a really easy way of understanding hormesis. If you sit still on a couch and do nothing, what happens to your muscles? They atrophy, right? Because what your body has is it has a energy conservation strategy of, if you don't use it, get rid of it, because muscle mass, for example, costs calories every day to keep, just sitting still. So our memory of calories are hard to find says, if muscle is not being used, break it down, get it out of here, because it's basically an expense we don't need, right? But hormesis basically says this: when you go in and you challenge a muscle past its, a certain point, then the organ, your response is that it tears the muscle down slightly. And so biologically, your strategy is, well, build it back, but build it back a little stronger because we need it stronger. It wasn't enough last time. Build it back a little stronger. And so if you keep on doing this and you're clever about how you do it, right? You give just the right amount of stress to break down the muscle the right amount. Then you rest long enough for it to recover. And then you do it again. Then you get what we call a hypertrophy of the muscle, which is the fancy way of saying it gets big and strong, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is hormesis. A static habitat for any organism lacks hormesis and therefore promotes atrophy. So what we did is we went in and we said, building buildings that are static habitat for human beings is easy. We can say, okay, HVAC engineer, mechanical engineer, it's doing the heating and cooling system. I want you to build the bloody thing so we keep 50% relative humidity and 72 degrees Fahrenheit blah, 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 exactly this, because we have a ASHRAE standard for comfort, and I want you to maintain the building at that year round, regardless of what's going on outside, right? And you do this for all the different dimensions of the habitat. You make it static. Then you put a living organism called a human being in that static habitat, and guess what happens? No hormesis, atrophy. Okay? So now, all of a sudden, because we put them in this, taking a huge amount of energy to maintain the static environment, right? Heating and cooling and, hot water heaters and all the things to give them this static environment to make it comfortable. What we've done is we've actually created an atrophying environment. And so now we're like, oh, by the way, yeah, you didn't want all those muscles to atrophy, so now you got to go to the gym and work out. And all the things, right, that, and we're going to feed you nutrient deficient food. And therefore, that's how we get to that upside down idea, right? We get to the upside down idea that health is this weird thing that you have to work hard for, and that degenerative state of health, what we call a degenerated homeostasis, is normal. It's because, if we put a zoo animal in that environment, we would call it cruelty. And I've gone in and told architects building schools, I looked at it and said, look, if we put a zoo animal into an environment this deprived of stimulation, it would be called animal cruelty, and rightly so. And you're about to put human children in an environment similarly deprived of stimulation. Then you're going to get upset when they get upset and try to drug them and call them, if they have mental health issues when they rebel against your static environment, which is so far out of the ecosystemic baseline that they need that they're biologically rebelling against it, neurologically rebelling against it. And you're like, well, we can fix that. We can basically medicate them to the point of numbness. Okay? And that's where we are, right? So it's like, I've been talking about creating dynamic habitat. And what's interesting is we did a presentation at the Biophilic Leadership Summit on this whole idea of using biophilic design to create dynamic habitat, right? We were going through this whole thing of homeostasis. And what was interesting is the very first thing I had to say when they when we got up was like, I have to make a correction to the title of this presentation, because what they had put in the program was creating dynamic human habitat using biophilic design. I said, that's not the title we submitted. We submitted the title creating dynamic habitat. Because what you're basically doing when you're saying creating dynamic human habitat, you're centering the human as the only thing of concern. And that's a losing proposition. It turns out that in order for us to be healthy, all of our neighbors have to be healthy. And so we have to create dynamic habitat, and that's habitat for all life. So here is the punchline to all of this. What I am trying to teach designers to think about these days is what it looks like to create dynamic habitat that regenerates all life, thereby regenerating human health and being able to do so using the ambient energy flows available from the surrounding environment without having to mine energy, and in so do, and greatly reducing the flows of extracted resources by recoupling the flows and cycling into the surrounding biosphere. By doing this, we actually improve quality of life, not because this is a big objection, right? Oh, you want us to use less energy and less stuff, and therefore you're wanting us to give up all. Yeah, I'm wanting you to give up. I want you to give up on social isolation. I'm wanting you to give up on your chronic degenerative diseases. I'm wanting you to give up on nutrient deficient food that tastes like nothing. I'm wanting you to give up on living in a isolated bubble that's separated from Nature that makes you, the fact that you're separated from nature makes you depressed. Yep, sorry, I want you to give up all that stuff. And that's the way I'm looking at it these days, right? So it's like, that may be like the punchline of what I'm trying to do, is people to understand this, but it requires a lot of reframing. And you notice this is a whole different paradigm. All the stories I'm telling you are different than the paradigm that people have internalized. And so, yeah, it's a heavy lift. And when we do that root cause analysis, we come all the way down to, yep, they're stuck in this paradigm. And these are the stories that make up that paradigm. And these are why these stories are now toxic, right? And then therefore, these are the things, what we have to basically do is tell a better story. So I've told people when we get there, they say, how do we fix the story? I say, and this is one of those sayings that you'll hear me go to occasionally. It's like, we don't need better technologists, we need better storytellers.
Yes.
Okay?
Yeah.
We know how to fix all the technological issues. The non-starter, I can teach the engineers, the architects, the urban planners, everything else, how to do that. What we are stuck in is we're stuck in stories that make up the narratives that are driving the paradigms that are driving our culture, or I call them anti-culture at this point in time. It's not a culture anymore, it's an anti-culture.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, so now we're down to the nub of it, because to me, this is consilience, the art of different disciplines sort of landing on the same spot.
Yes.
I started as a guy who data works for me. And it's my training and my background, and maybe just how I'm built a little bit, and maybe that's why I had the training I got. But so I like to say I'm a quick learner. Eventually, took me forever, Alan, to realize that my charts weren't doing squat in the world. Years. Just like it just made all the sense. Like, doesn't this make sense?
Mm-hmm.
And I have to couple that to the fact that my nickname when I was a boy was Nature Boy. I spent all my time outside.
Yep.
I didn't know where snakes and turtles were. I would say, which one would you like to go see? They all had names. Like, I knew under this board was that, and I was very covetous. Like, I wouldn't show anybody where my Eastern hognose lived, because he was special. Right. So,
yes.
So that was my background. And then I realized over time that I wasn't in the business of sharing data. I was in the business of challenging beliefs. That was my first bump up against it. And I've spent a lot of time since then trying to understand things from a human, so behavioral psychology. I went into psychology itself. I did a lot of my own personal inner work so I could understand my own thing. I bumped up against my own belief systems. I red team, blue team, things all the time to see if I can see it from other directions.
Right.
And so now, I mean, you're one of the few people I've managed to bump into who gets it at that level. It's like, look at all this complicated, beautiful stuff we have to do, and it's very technological, and we can talk your ear off about all of it. None of it matters if our underlying stories are wrong.
Yeah.
Right. Simple example. I tell this people all the time, like, well, what if there is, 0 point energy, or what if fusion comes along? I'm like, look, the sun heats stuff up beautifully. We're still not using it to heat our water in our homes. 25% of the energy consumption in a home or a building is typically heating the water. Why aren't we using this unsexy technology from the 70s? It probably goes back further, to, make a box, run some pipes in it, gather that heat in a tank. We don't do it. The only reason we don't do it is because we have the wrong story. It's got to be. It's not a question of economics. These systems pay themselves back. Social justice. This would be great if people could have free hot water. The systems pay themselves back. Less dependence on foreign oil, whatever the story. I mean, makes total sense, but we don't do it.
So you're about to get me to go on like an hour-long side thing on solar thermal, which you don't want to get me off there.
All right. Well, I'm just but their question. So for you, why don't we do it? What's in the way? Because we have to remove that, whatever that thing is.
Right.
That's the issue.
Yeah. So again, we come down to, there are narratives that are higher level narratives, and then there are underlying narratives, and then those rest all the way down on metaphors, right? And but there are what I would call foundational narratives. And those foundational narratives, though, rest all the way down on those underlying metaphors. Now, I'm going to go there for a minute because I have to answer that question. Remember back, if you're trying to The term metaphor is now used fairly loosely. When I'm using it very precisely, okay? A metaphor, if you go, remember all the way back to like high school English or, whatever, they're talking about poetry, and a metaphor is X is like Y or is Y, like is a simile, this is like that as a simile, and this is that as a metaphor, okay? So, my love is a red, red rose, that sort of stuff, right? It's a metaphor. It's equating two unlike things in order to point out similarities or to use the patterning of one to help make sense of the patterning of another, okay? And, well, as you go down that root cause analysis, you come down and you realize that our abstract thought, our ability to have abstract thought, is really built upon metaphors, because we are an embodied intellect. And this is one of the reasons we got stuck for a while, because this is one of the things that René Descartes was after. He was like, and the part of the problem with the Cartesian split, basically having us think of ourselves as a disembodied intellect. And it turns out that humans are not a disembodied intellect. As a matter of fact, we can't actually think as a disembodied entity. We're deeply embodied. What that basically means is that we are a brain that is in a body and is deeply connected to the body, and our whole way of abstractly reasoning about the universe is deeply, deeply affected by the fact that we live in a body, okay? And so what ended up happening was René Descartes was like, nope, we can't trust our own senses. The only thing we can trust is our abstract intellect. Therefore, we have to remove it and think of it as removed from the body, right? And there you go. And that's how we got to the Cartesian split, where we did that. And at that moment, it started to hide the fact that metaphor is the way we make sense of the universe abstractly. Like we can make sense of the universe, like, yeah, I can feel this, but when we start thinking about abstract stuff like love, or and the one that's used, and again, we've been talking about this book, we mentioned it first time you and I talked, I mentioned this book, which is Metaphors We Live By Lakoff and Johnson. They're linguists that make the very compelling argument that it is metaphor that underlies the way we think about anything abstractly. And the first example they use in the book is, what is the framing metaphor we use for argument? Because argument is an abstract thing. We're using language and throwing language back and forth at each other in an exchange that has certain consequences and outcomes. So, well, that's an abstract thing. So we have an underlying, and for most people, completely unidentified metaphor. And the one that they point out is, in Western civilization, most people's underlying metaphor is argument is war. Okay? I'm going to defend my position. I'm going to attack her argument. I'm going to destroy, her defense. It's like, so that underlying metaphor is taking an abstract thing and relating it back to a very embodied thing of us like fighting with each other physically, okay? So we frame the whole way we think about having an argument, and there's a consequence to that, right? A fight has a winner and a loser, and therefore, if you use the framing metaphor, the argument is war, you bring that concept over. Arguments have winners and losers. Oh boy, there's a consequence to that, right? I don't want to be the loser. Okay, I better be the winner. What that means is the person you're arguing with is also your opponent, not your partner. Okay, so there's deep consequences to these underlying metaphors. And again, it's another one of those things to just stop and meditate upon for a little while. Okay, and so the question that comes up is, again, as we've discussed, is like, well, what if you use a different metaphor? And for me, I ask the question, what if we use the metaphor of argument as dance? Dance in which the goal is you dance with your partner in the goal of obtaining the beauty of truth. Now there's no winner and loser. Now you're actually cooperating, not competing. That underlying metaphor, and we would change the whole language of argument, right? There would be no more I'm attacking her position and she's defending, or she destroyed my argument or whatever. There's none of that. All that languaging goes away. And now we would come up with a whole different language. It'd be a really kind of fun exercise to figure out what the language would be if you came up with all of the language around argument that would come out of the metaphor of, argument as a dance in pursuit of the beauty of truth. Okay, so that's powerful. That basically tells us so I originally got to paradigms, and then I had to go down into narratives, right? And then I had to go from narratives down to metaphors. And that now seems to be where I'm finding the bottom. It's like those framing metaphors. Then along came another thinker, another powerful thinker, Jeremy Lent, okay? And I also pulled one of his latest books. He's also got, I think it's called The Pattern Instinct. Here's another one, The Web of Meaning by Jeremy Lent, right? And he talks about how civilizations have underlying framing metaphors upon which they're in, like the whole story of their is sort of built in layers, right? Foundational narratives are built on top of the framing metaphors, and then you build all the way up to the paradigm that runs the civilization. And so I won't go back. He goes all the way back to immediate return hunter-gatherers and what he thinks their framing metaphors were. We won't go through all of that. But the critical one is, what was the framing the framing metaphor last shifted, according to him, during the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution. And a new framing metaphor came out, and we've already alluded to it, which was the framing metaphor of the Cartesian Newtonian paradigm. You dig all the way down, the question being asked was, well, what is the nature of nature? What is the nature of the universe, of the laws of what is it, right? And there was this moment of hope that maybe the insight of Newton would give us this way of deciphering everything. And that using our disembodied intellect, aka, from Descartes, we could analyze the material universe with a set of, there's a materialist reductionist way of inquiry. And therefore, the framing metaphor that Jeremy Lent identifies, and the more I thought about this, the more I think he's right, is nature is machine. Okay? Nature is machine. Learn about it by taking it apart into its constituent components, learning about the constituent components, and when you do that, you will end up understanding the machine. Okay? Now, as we've alluded to earlier, it turns out nature is nothing like that. Turns out nature is a complex, nonlinear, dynamical holarchy, which is a set of nested holons, or you can call it a system, but it's more technically correct to call it a holarchy, okay? And it does not work like that because it has a bunch of things. First of all, it's nonlinear, has sensitive dependence on initial conditions. You need to go study, it's all the stuff we study through it. Instead of having predictabilities, it reacts with what I call dynamic attractors. And by the way, that's my term for for those of you who have studied complexity theory, if you've heard of a strange attractor, I don't call it a strange attractor, I call it a dynamic attractor, because there's another thing that I talk about called a static attractor. And again, I'm having to reframe some of this stuff because it's like now we're having to get into the application of it to the real world, and so we're having to actually look at its implications, right? So what I'm looking at is how to take this science that emerged in the 20th century of understanding complex nonlinear dynamic holarchies or systems and applying that to the process of design, right? And what it turns out is that we have this thing called emergent properties. And what that basically means is that even when you have simple bits and pieces that you think are all simple mechanistic, mechanical bits, and they start to interact, things can emerge from those interactions that you would never have predicted by looking at the behavior of the individual pieces, right? There's now like a 30-minute lecture on like an example of using human traffic in cars and how you get traffic jams as emergent properties, right? And there's a couple very simple rules when you're driving down the interstate as to what you do. You know, you're a pretty complicated thing, but when you're in a car driving down the interstate, it's like I stay in my lane. You know, I speed up to go to the speed limit when I can. If somebody's in front of me that's slower, I slow down to stop to keep from hitting them in the rear end. Blah blah blah. Simple rules, right? A couple simple rules. And from this whole thing we've all run into of running into this, you know, like traffic snarl in interstate, and you like come to a halt, and then like you creep forward for like 30 minutes, and all of a sudden all the cars ahead of you are like, you know, speeding up and going, and you're like, and you speed up and go yourself, and you're like, what just happened, right? Why did we do that, right? Why did we do that? Well, what happened was that somebody at some point cut in front of somebody else, and they slammed on the brakes to keep from hitting the person in front of them. And the person behind them slammed on the brakes, and what we ended up with was the simple rule, right? If everybody slows down to keep from hitting the person in front of them, and then what ends up happening is we get this chain reaction, and the people in the front are accelerating away, but now we have a bunch of cars that are like sitting there, and slowly new cars pile up on the back, and then the cars at the front accelerate away, and we get there an hour later. Not a single car that was originally involved in it is still there, they're gone. But the emergent property of this little traffic jam is sitting there that was caused by this behavior of somebody pulling in front of somebody else and causing a chain reaction and so forth. That's an emergent property. Now, that's not intuitively obvious. If I just explain to you a couple of rules about how drivers run on an interstate, it's not intuitively obvious that that's going to happen. But then you see it and you realize that's an emergent property of those set of simple rules, right? And it turns out that a huge percentage of what goes on in natural ecosystems are emergent. Therefore, if your methodology of study of natural ecosystems is materialist reductionist, which is take it apart into its component parts and study those things, you have a powerful way of inquiring about the universe, but it's only half the toolkit. Systems level, holistic thing. And this is where we go back to the book, you know, Dune, Frank Herbert. Frank Herbert was an interesting ecologist, right? The first law of the Mentat. It's not the litany against fear. That's the whole thing, like, about fear. No. This is the first law of the Mentat, which almost everybody misses. It was the second time I read Dune before I caught it, like when I was older. It's this. The first law of the Mentat is one does not understand a process by stopping it. One must join the flow of the process in order to understand the process, right? So the whole method of scientific inquiry from the scientific revolution was violating the first law of the Mentat. We stop the process in order to understand it. We tear it up, we take the process apart, right? Because so much of the process that's happening ecologically on the planet is an emergent property of the interaction of simpler components, that when we stop the process and try to do quote unquote science on it, we miss a huge amount of what's going on. So this is where we're getting to the point where science is now having to embrace more holistic ways of inquiry, of actually analyzing processes as they flow, not by stopping them. But the problem is we're still stuck with design that comes out of this reductionist materialist way of thinking. And therefore, it wants to nail everything down and make it stop the process. It wants to, and process regeneration is a process. So if you stop the process, you stop the regeneration, and therefore, by definition, it's degenerative. It's that simple, right? And so now we're down to this whole thing of nature is machine, okay? And this drives so much. Like we come all the way back to that question you originally asked us, why can't we get out of this? Why are we stuck in these stories down at this very bottom? It's because we're actually using a narrative that for a little while was okay. It was wrong, but it gave us a means of inquiry that let us learn a lot of stuff. And the negatives of it hadn't built up to the point where it was going to kill us. So we could get by with it as a framing narrative, a framing metaphor, excuse me. Now we're getting to the point where nature is machine as a framing metaphor is literally like driving a set of malignant narratives that are keeping in place a toxic paradigm. And so the only way that I am able to see, if we do root cause analysis to get all the way down to the bottom, is to get rid of the nature is machine metaphor and the narratives that rest immediately on top of it.
Now, so many great points there. And I noticed that there's a core paradox here for me, which is that a lot of the people who are in that technocracy, right? They're deathly afraid of death, and they operate a death cult, which is the paradox to me, right?
Yes.
And so this, if we go back to, I don't know, let's call it the Enlightenment, if that's where there was a departure, nothing wrong with it. Figure out what you can from a reductionist standpoint, but at some point you take that path as far as you can. You go, okay, it's that, and it's something else too.
Right.
We haven't made the jump yet, and so this isn't gender. This is a set of metaphors for me, which is the masculine and the feminine, right? That duality. So the masculine, I'll just say, very reductionist. You know, we're going to left brain this, take everything apart, put it back together, figure it out. This whole great next period of time to me has to be about how we return to that more holistic, the right brain, the feminine, again, not gender, but as an organizing architecture. The best I ever heard it described was if you said masculine can be described as stillness. So you see all these, when dudes get together and make a religion, they're like, we're going to sit in a cave and we're not going to talk for 10 years. We're going to shut everything down and achieve that stillness. And women come together, and next thing you know, you're celebrating 8 turns of the seasons, and there's a lot of explosion. So women are about flow, the feminine flow, stillness and flow. So we don't have that balance. So I see this whole next period as it's a great rebalancing, but our core metaphors are broken, right? Because they fundamentally say something that I think is completely wrong, which is the world is a random, cruel place. We should control that as much as we possibly can.
Right.
And our salvation is in the complete dominion and control of this thing. But as we go there, we end up breaking the very thing that is sustaining us in the first place. It's a very odd place to be in this moment of history.
It is. And of course, I tend to use the term, because I studied martial arts from the time I was very young. So I tend to use the term yin and yang as these complementary balancing opposites. And in traditional Chinese medicine and Ayurvedic medicine and so forth that I've studied a little bit of, we would say that if you have an imbalance of yin and yang, that you have an imbalance in a healthy system, right? So it's like if you do all yang, then you end up with a yin deficiency, then you're not going to be healthy, right? And so today we kind of get into, again, because of certain narratives that have been unfolding, we get into trigger words if we use words like masculine and feminine. So it's just like, okay, I don't want to get caught up in that at the moment, because it's not the point I'm trying to make. It's like we're trying to make this argument about the yin and the yang, these balanced things and so forth, right? And so that's kind of how I've usually framed that, and that we end up with a balance between them, and that we have to embrace both the yin and the yang means of inquiry. The reductionist mode of inquiry has to be balanced by the system's holistic mode of inquiry. All of either one is imbalanced. We need them both in balance. And so what I'm arguing for is a return to balance, not a throwing away of what we've done, but instead saying that we've now done it exclusively in an unbalanced way for so long that the output is toxic. And that's kind of where we are. And speaking of active environments, I warned Chris I was going to do this. Okay, speaking of active environments, I've been sitting for too long, so now it's time for me to stand up for a little while. So the desk will now stand with me, and I can continue talking. But it's like,
all right.
Yeah, it's like, again, we put people behind desks for a long time, and we need to change. We need a dynamic environment, so a dynamic habitat and so forth. And yeah, I mean, the house I'm in is not ideal. I've got plans for something a lot different. And I've been helping different people design and build the sorts of dynamic habitats with selectively permeable, building envelopes and so forth, so that we can open up and actually have, a way of being with and engaging with the environment that allows us to select according to what we need in the moment, right? So we would have sanctuaries in the middle of the house that are fairly controlled for the moments we need that. And then it allows us to move out to a fully unintermediated environment where we can engage with the environment fully, right? But do that in steps. Because if we basically just have, one of the big things that buildings do today, by the way, is they build this building envelope just like this, and you have static environment inside and fully unprotected environment outside. And psychologically, it's our body is like, ooh, I don't know, that's a lot of change very quickly, and therefore it's a little jarring. And so this is why houses used to have porches. Remember that? It's a covered transition area. Just even having a porch with a covered transition area that's nice and gives you that helps, right? It's like, besides just walking out a door and having nothing. So it's really interesting that just because of little details in how we build a building, we can psychologically trap somebody in the building. They go inside, and it's actually psychologically difficult for them to go back outside, and they don't even know it. Their body is telling them that not to go through that transition, because that transition is very abrupt. And so by just thinking about how we build the building and how we allow for this selective permeability and the ability to go through gradients instead of hit large, super challenging abrupt transitions, we can encourage people to be able to engage with their environment in much more healthy ways.
I love the idea. And, I'm thinking about how, because you touched on this a bunch, I think as a final topic here is, what do we do with education, right? Because you mentioned already that maybe taking children, and particularly young boys, and putting them to a highly static environment doesn't work for all of them. Yeah. Or maybe many of them. And that the response to that is to say there's something wrong with the kid, not the environment. In fact, no, there's something wrong with the environment in that particular example. And so I know a lot of people are struggling with this, question, should I homeschool? Should my kids go to, public school? Very challenging conversation, but even more relevant for a lot of folks is, what do I do with college now and universities? Because there's when we talk about framing metaphors, a lot of people have come to the conclusion, Alan, that a university is a place where you go and you spend a lot of money to learn some things you're going to probably have to spend more money or lost opportunity unlearning, because they're just that wrong.
Right.
In your mind, are colleges, really preparing people for the world that is now unfolding?
Yes. So I was thinking about this one before we got on the call, and there's a term that our friends over in the British Royal Air Force use in reference to fighter jets. When its jet engine throws a rotor, right? Now, when the rotor has a shroud around it, so if the rotor comes apart, it tries to contain the shrapnel. However, it doesn't always work. And what happens is, when you throw a rotor, sometimes the shrapnel gets loose and basically shreds the aircraft. And of course, they have a typical British understated way of this. It's called catastrophic self-disassembly. Okay. Yep. So what I think we're seeing is that a certain tranche of universities around the world are undergoing catastrophic self-disassembly right now. Yeah. They are basically they have an identity crisis as to what they're supposed to be doing. And I mean, there's so much we could go into here, right? Because I mean, obviously, in the beginning, universities were sort of a quote unquote liberal education, and in the old sense of that word, right? In the old sense of that word, they were to provide a liberal education. And then as we got into the 20th century, they became like, oh, we really need to provide a vocational education, because we need to meet the demands of the workplace, right? Our job is to equip people for a workforce. And so then we have this weird, we have infrastructure that was created, I'm trying to remember who the quote is. You probably remember the quote, right? We have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technologies, right? That's a quote and so forth. Well, here we are, right? We have a workplace that is demanding that we have people come out and work with this super quote unquote high tech thing, right? But it's being, and the university is still sort of a medieval institution, and it's basically taking people who have Paleolithic not only emotions but also cognitive processes and physiological processes, and it's gotten to the point now where what it tries to do is treat the human being as a disembodied intellect, again from Mr. Descartes, and push them through this pipeline, which has really just become a money-making pipeline. But then, because they spent so much time and effort convincing everybody that their piece of paper that they were selling you was critically important to document your ability to think and your knowledge of a subject, that people realized that they were ideal for indoctrinating certain ways of thinking. And so what we've had that people who are trying to indoctrinate a certain way of thinking into the culture have realized that here you have this thing that children have been told over and over again, you got to go to college, you got to get your degree, and so on and so forth, that we can pipeline them through this, and we can indoctrinate them with a way of thinking that supports our power position. Okay. So, all right, let's get practical for a moment. Most undergraduate degrees, most graduate degrees have a negative financial return on investment now.
True.
The opportunity costs, that you add them up and look at that, it's like, okay, it used to be like when I think both of us were coming up or coming of age in college, you could go major in just about anything, and get a 4-year degree, and there was a positive return on investment of that. You would make more money, you would be able to get a better job, and so on and so forth. Well, we're now down to the point where that is no longer true, of course. We've had that for a while. We used to, even when I was coming through college, we would joke with the philosophy majors, right? We said, oh, you're going to major in philosophy. You are learning to ask the deep questions of life, like, why are we here? What is the meaning of life? Would you like fries with that? Right? Mm-hmm. And, that was kind of how we would make fun of the philosophy majors. But even then, they could still actually, come out and find. Today, it's like engineering degrees, some and certain medical degrees probably have a positive return on investment. And so some technological degrees and so forth. What's interesting is law degrees are becoming increasingly problematic, because what we're getting to is that AI is displacing a lot of that. The AI is able to do a lot of the paralegal and junior legal work nowadays. And so what we're starting to see is people who are coming out, I've met people who came out top in their law school, can't find work, right? So it used to be that, yeah, you become a doctor, lawyer, engineer, you're set, right? It's like, there you go. Or go get a PhD and you'll be guaranteed in certain things, you'd be almost guaranteed to be able to be faculty somewhere, and so on. Those things are coming apart. We don't have enough excess resources to maintain that level of complexity. And so what's happening is financially, it's starting to be rationed out financially. The people who can afford it have the luxury of going to college, whether it has a positive ROI or not. The people who want to take the risk and go in and invest all that money and get into all that debt. But more and more I'm running into kids, I'm talking to these Gen Zers, they're like, no, thank you. It's like, we're not going to play that game. We do not want to go get into that kind of debt and then be locked in cubicle prison, because we know what that is. We don't want that. Number two is that increasingly I'm running into a tranche of Gen Z who are just growing up with a big awareness of how broken the system is. And so we're getting this interesting thing, even among the kids that are majoring. I run into a lot of them, they're majoring in engineering or architecture and things like this because of the groups I'm working with. And so I was talking to a young man literally just last Friday night. He called because he's in civil engineering, and he wants to be able to do large scale hydrological repair. He sees the problem. He knows it's got to be attacked systemically. He wants to do this. He's going in. He's saying, if I major in civil engineering, become a civil engineer, PE, professional engineer, I can stamp, I can put my PE stamp on things and approve large scale stuff. He's looking at it and he's in it and he's taking these classes and he's going, what is this? Right? He's like, what is this? And he'd heard me do a guest lecture. And so he called me out of like desperation, because he'd ask all these different people. He'd call he talked to the Department of Sustainability, and he had talked to, his different advisors and the dean of the school, all these kinds of people he talked to. And none of them were like, well, we can offer you a multidisciplinary approach. We'll let you take a couple of classes over here and a couple of classes over here and a couple of classes over here. We'll call that a multidisciplinary degree in civil engineering. And what it was there was no context. It was like, we'll let you take a couple of classes in ecology, but it's like, that's its own little silo, right? And so what they were basically offering him, they couldn't offer him any way of seeing how to apply. So there's two things that were going on. One was, everything that he's being taught is in service of the existing paradigm, the existing way of doing it, the existing way of, they said, the death cult way of engineering, it's all in there. And then the second thing is, nobody is providing a systems view. Nobody is doing that. And he knew that I had talked from a systems view. So he called me, and the first thing I did for him was just acknowledge that, yes. So he's looking around all the universities. He's like, where can I go? Which university is doing it? I'm like, I don't know of one. I know of a couple who are talking about it. Okay. But I don't know of any of them that are really doing it yet. And so, okay, maybe that's starting to move. But number two is, I said, okay, just do this. I said, go, if you're going to do this and you want to do that, go ahead and get your civil engineering degree and like specialize in hydrology, and get out and get your PE. And then I can teach you how to take all those tools and flip them and use them for regenerative purposes, right? So, boy, what I would say is pretty much all the liberal arts degrees now are in danger of just becoming indoctrination machines, because they've been hijacked by power structures that want to use them for that purpose. And would I recommend people paying that amount of money to send a student in that formative phase of their intellectual career through a propaganda machine like that? No. It's not going to return on investment economically, and it's going to provide profound damage to their ability to be an independent thinker.
And that's the key point, because the context is all here. I can look up any piece of information I want, right?
Yeah.
That wasn't necessarily true when I was going to school. You had to carry a lot around in your head, right? Yes. Or to make trips back to the library and flip pages, Yes. So that was different. So how, you think, is more important than the what? The what's all on the phone. And now we're seeing that first level of thought process also being taken over by AI, right? Professors are struggling with this idea that ChatGPT does a pretty credible job of structuring arguments and thought processes, right? So, even that, it's, when you say, what is, this habituation, we're getting flaccid on the couch, right? But up here, but even more than that, I'm a free speech absolutist, because Alan, I'm of the ilk that says that my arguments never get sharpened until they really get challenged. And that process of challenge is by definition uncomfortable, right?
Yeah.
It's just uncomfortable. It just is. And I was talking with Brett and also Peter Boghossian about this a while back, and they both said the same thing. They said that when they started teaching in college, the point was to challenge the students, and it somehow morphed and flipped, and now you're not supposed to. You get in trouble. Hey, you're making your students uncomfortable, or whatever. And they wrap the elitism, you're doing some ism to them around that whole thing. But because I'm a free speech absolutist, because I believe the point of free speech is to challenge and confront, what I'm worried about is free speech is meaningless if you don't have free thought.
Yes.
And the thought processes, I see them wrapping people into, they are constraining, not liberating, fundamentally.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Right. You know, and so that I think is a great tragedy, because if I see us like, we're going to need extra creative people going forward, is the way I look at it. And we're actually indoctrinating people to be the opposite of creative, and to be fearful of having a differing opinion or a challenging thought. It just seems like a big setup. So my conclusion would also be, no, absolutely do not spend money to wreck your thinking.
Yeah. So I almost pulled this book
free
off the shelf and brought it in, because I pulled off a few books, as you noticed, that I thought we might run into. I almost pulled this one, because I thought,
I love that.
We might get there. It's a book by Flo Conway called Snapping. Okay. Snapping by Flo Conway. It's one of the most accessible books on cults and the way cults actually operate. Okay. And how people are brought into cults and how you get them out of cults. So worth reading for that. I don't have time to go through all of it. It would take, again, when I start working with people at certain levels, we actually go through all this. Like, how do you get people into cults? What does it look like, and so forth, right? And you know, a lot of what's being driven right now is cult behavior in some of these colleges. Literally, I'm not using that as a pejorative. I'm using that as a clinical, you know, you probably notice I try not to use pejorative terms. I try to just call things very neutrally by clinical terms. And here I'm talking about a cult as a very specific sociological and psychological phenomena. Okay. And so when I say that they are cults, I'm not using what, again, we'll go back to John Michael Greer, a snarl word. Okay. To him, a snarl word is a word you just throw out there to stop the thinking. And by the way, the snarl word is a strategy of a cult, right? To throw out a word like, oh, you're a racist, or you're a socialist, or you're a fascist, or you're a whatever, in a way that's designed to stop thinking, the thinking process, that is actually a technique used by cults. Okay. So what I'm pointing out is here, I'm not doing that. I'm using the word cult in a very specific way. Okay. In its clinical definition, so to speak. And so what's happening is you're seeing cult-like behavior, which is training people with a set of reflexive answers and a worldview that you have trained them into, which they have been told it is dangerous and unallowed to be questioned. And they have been programmed with certain reflexive answers. So if somebody tries to poke them with a question that would make them think about that instead of engaging and thinking about it, they can simply regurgitate the pre-programmed answer. Okay. And also, you put into the belief system certain inoculations against other ways of thinking. So you say things like, oh, logic and reason are tools of the predominant power hierarchy. And if anybody tries to use logic and reason, they are attempting to subjugate you. Okay? They're attempting to use a tool of the colonializing power to be able to maintain you and subjugate you. Now, what's interesting is I have never, in dealing with authentic indigenous people, had any of them take that viewpoint. None of them. Never. And so what it is an inoculating idea from a cult, so that when somebody shows up and tries to use logic and reason to engage with this set of beliefs that has been indoctrinated into a person, that they actually start shouting down the person, asking those questions, because it's part of the immune system of the cult. It's been built in, right? And so you have to understand that if you're going and you're sending certain people through certain university programs at the moment, they are being literally basically indoctrinated into a cult-like way of thinking in which they are being taught not to critically think, that it is dangerous to do so, and that anybody that actually challenges you to do so is attempting to subjugate you and put you under and continue to hold you down and so forth. Now, the reason I mentioned the fact that there may be some like engineering schools and so forth that are still quote unquote worth it is because there are still around some like engineering programs in which this is not predominant yet, in which most of the curriculum is around, how do you do the equations? How do you build a bridge? How do you, that sort of stuff, right? And so there may be a few places where I've got very smart kids. I'm like, if you strategically go in and get that degree at that school, you'll get useful tools and useful learning out of it. But there's an awful lot of other degrees and other schools where you look at it going, no, you're going to be basically paid to be indoctrinated into a literal cult. And don't take my word for that. That's actually another thing that cult leader would say, no, I'm the expert. Pay attention to me. I've got it all figured out, right? And here's what you need to know. I'm saying, no, go do your research. Go read about cults and how cults operate. And then that also starts to, if you've read Matthias Desmet's book on totalitarianism, the thing about cults will actually inform how you get mass formation. The processes of understanding how cults do what they do will help you understand how you get mass formation.
Well, it's critical because there's both the getting in and then getting out of the cult. And I would submit these days, the only question you have to ask yourself is, which cult do you want to belong to? Because to me, a cult is a dominant, organized way of thinking, but it defends itself principally with one thing. I like the inoculation. That's another subtlety. But for me, I know I'm dealing with a cult when you're not allowed to ask questions.
Yes.
Right? They get shouted down. You just can't ask basic primary questions, right? Like, we saw this during COVID and with the vaccines and all of this, where people would ask their doctors basic questions like, how do you know it's safe? And they had no supporting data because none existed. The material data safety sheet was literally a blank sheet of paper. They had no data, but people got fired by their doctors and, they weren't allowed to go, it was just all that. Because, and Matthias clued me in that. He's like, you have to ask the way these mass formations get undone if they're going to be derailed before they go to mass atrocities is you have to ask those questions that can't be resolved. Because you can't force somebody, you can't waterboard them out of a cult, right? You got it, but you ask the questions that don't line up. Like, hey, Bob, I see you've belonged to this group, and the guru seems to be a really nice guy. So you've taken a vow of poverty and chastity. Why is he driving off in a Rolls Royce with your girlfriend? Can you explain that to me?
Yes. So this is where
just Bob can't resolve.
This is where the book Snapping is quite interesting. It talks about a lot of the culting things that were going on in the 70s and 80s, remember all of that. And it talks about the deprogrammers and what they figured out about having to help people get out of cults. And they actually have some interviews with a few of the deprogrammers that had to go into it. And basically, what you're saying is like, they had people who like their families would hire a deprogrammer to go kidnap them, pull them physically out of the cult, and deprogram them because they wouldn't leave otherwise, right? And so they had some interviews with these people who were deprogrammers, and the first thing that they said was basically this: well, how do you deprogram this? Well, the first thing it says is you have to actually get them asking questions. And the whole thing is that, as I said, they have been programmed with defenses against question asking. They've been told a couple things. Number one is that the enemy, the other, it's othering is part of this, right? The other will try to trick you by getting you to ask questions. Number two, if they ask you questions, here's the answers. And they take the most likely questions. They give you pre-programmed answers so you do not, have to respond to them, right? And then, so those things are, let's like put in there as part of the programming. And so the deprogrammers, what they were basically saying is what we have to do is we have to talk to them and figure out a way around that defense mechanism to get them to actually ask a legitimate question, right? We have to get around the canned answers, and we've got to get around this thing of don't let them ask you questions, because if you do that, they're going to trick you. They're out to trick you, and they're devilishly clever. And if you actually ask any questions, they're going to use that against you, and they're going to mislead you and everything. So that's what they do. Okay, so they had to get them to literally start asking questions. And the reason the book is called Snapping is because at some point, if you can get people to do that, they quote unquote snap out of it. It's like, and they can't understand how they were thinking. They look back at it and go, I can't understand what I was doing. Well, what you find was they snapped into it as a defensive mechanism. That at some point, they had so much cognitive distance, they had so much thing going on, and so on. And by the way, it's like if you want to put somebody into a cult quickly, what you do is you sleep deprive them, you control what they focus their mind on, you feed them poorly, you feed them bad food, you surround them with extremely high peer pressure, right? And all these kinds of, and it goes through in the book exactly how you do it, right? And so it's simple. If you want to know how to anti-cult, okay, it's simple. Get people good rest, de-stress them, give them great nutrient-dense food, encourage them to ask sincere questions, get them out in nature where their brain can pattern on that, okay, instead of keeping it narrowly focused on something artificial, right? In other words, make a person healthy and resilient and so forth, and you're anti-culting them. You are getting them to be more cult resistant, okay? But here was the other interesting thing that the deprogrammers said. They said, the thing is, once they snap out of it, you can't stop. So it's like a battery that has become discharged. You'll get them to think a little bit, but if you don't keep the process going, like if you jump her off the battery and you shut it back down before you let it, the alternator recharge the battery, then you'll just shut right back down, and you haven't recharged the battery. So what we had to do is we have to keep the process going, and in order to keep them going, we had to actually then move them into a intermediate halfway house in which they were around other people who were further on the process of deculting, so they could continue to talk about what happened. Because if you just let them go off by themselves, their brain would want to shut back down, and they would snap back into it, because it was still this trauma going on, right? They had snapped out of it, but now they were having to deal with all this cycle, again, cognitive dissonance and everything else. They let it shut down, and poof, what do? Right back into that culted state, right? So it's like, not only did you have to do the work of deculting and getting them to snap out of it, you also had to put them around other thinkers that would continue to model what it looked like to actively think and ask questions.
This is the thing that I value very highly about myself is how much I think very freely, and I'm smart enough to know that in order to do that, I have to limit my exposure to, well, I'll call it mass media. Yes. Because I look at that and it's just this reprogramming. It's very persistent. It's very pervasive. If I had, as part of my day, my TV, I don't have one, but if I had one and CNN was running, I look at that thing now just clinically and I'm like, wow, this is like an enforced adult ADHD, because you don't know what to focus on. They've got a crawler that has nothing to do with the two people. The people are talking about something that's 4 minutes long at most, and it's disconnected from anything else. It's just like, it looks to me like it was clinically designed to fracture your attention. And then if you watch it more carefully, it's busy just repetitively repeating talking points and various things that it wants you to adopt as belief systems. And then I've tracked that out in the wild, and I'll have people say, oh, Putin is evil. And you scratch at that, and you hit primer right away. You're like, well, what's your data for that? And they got nothing. They don't even know where the data came from, right? It's a belief system that just got literally programmed. It's a funny thing to watch. Yeah.
So one of the scariest
school. Well, the question, I mean, so you're saying, like, if you're going to take people like this bright young guy who called you last Friday and said, what do I do about this? I mean, what we're really saying is you need to pick people up out of that reinforcing system with its broken ideologies, and you've got to get them in a nourishing place where they can interact with enough surface area boundaries of other people who aren't caught up in that for this to
Yes.
achieve some sort of life of its own, right?
Yes. So I was about to say is I think one of the scariest things out of that entire book on cults is the description of an expert in cults who at one point in time decided what he was going to do was infiltrate a cult in order to understand better the techniques they were using. And I'm trying to remember what his educational background was, but he was a psychologist, and so he understood. He was one of the experts at the time on the techniques of culting. And he's like, I want to better understand. So he picked and he went into a cult undercover. And he ended up staying, I'm trying to remember, 3 days. And he ended up fleeing in the middle of the night. And he said, if I had stayed another day, I never would have left. He said the psychological pressure they were bringing to bear was so great that even if you know what they're doing, you can't withstand it for very long. Okay. Now, what you basically have is a culture around you that is bringing to bear the same kind of pressure, just albeit not so with so much intensity, right? It takes longer. But how many people are there who have now stayed in that cult long enough that they're not going to leave of their own volition, right? And that's the problem. That is the problem with knowingly going into a territory in which culting tactics are being used at scale. So, people ask me, how do you get all this stuff done? Hey, this or such. I said, rule number one, I don't have a television. I don't have a Netflix account. And I don't watch mass media. I understand the cult programming techniques well enough that even though I understand exactly what they're trying to do, I understand that I have a human cognitive system that is not immune from that. Right? So that to me is important. Number two is, we know that the number one predictor of the way you think, and also, of course, of your economic success, is the average of the 7 people you spend the most time around. So it's like, that's critically important. Who are you keeping company with? Are they people, if you're keeping people company with everybody around you is basically programmed not to ask questions and to embrace, business as usual and not think about how we make a better existence for our children and grandchildren, then that's not the right group to be hanging around with. You need to, because you're going to fall into that average. It's just human nature. Again, it's part of our energy saving strategy that we have as human beings to be like, oh, I have to trust the people around me because I cannot take on every single thought process I need from primary, first principles and think it all the way through. I ain't got time for that. It's way too much energy. I have to crowdsource my thinking to some degree in order to successfully exist. What that means is, if you're going to crowdsource your thinking, you need to be very careful about the crowd.
Indeed we do. So very well said. Alan, the world is a better place with you in it. I'm glad to know you. And and I've really enjoyed this conversation, and I know we're going to have more going forward. And I really want to leave people with this idea that we have to get down to really being very precise about what are the metaphors, what are the narratives that we construct off of that? Do we have the right ones in place? Who are we spending our time with? These are all fairly native concepts to my audience that's with me at Peak Prosperity, but of course this will go out to the much wider world. So anybody listening, really, this is it. It's for all the marbles, and this is your chance to look at the world and really engage with it as it is. And that's the greatest gift. Every generation stretching back thousands of years where we have written record, they've had the same questions. How do I get meaning and purpose? Who am I? Why am I here? Very big existential things. But first you have to let go of the narrative that's not serving you. And for a lot of you who are listening to this, I know that's already true. You know that you hate your job, you don't feel healthy, you don't feel like your relationships are nourishing or what they ought to be. There's some part of you that's not satisfied with how things are. So this is the kind of this is where the freedom begins. So freedom of speech, freedom of thought, and knowing how to think. So Alan, thank you so much for sharing how to think. Please tell people how they can follow you and maybe take one of your amazing courses.
Yes, well, I'm currently the vehicle I've been working with to kind of get to the point of being able to teach and bring some of this out is called the Institute of Integrated Regenerative Design. I won't unpack all that in detail. I'll just say that the integrated part means that we actually have to get all the experts out of their silos and thinking together transdisciplinarily, right? And that we need to get out of degenerative thinking into regenerative thinking, where we are using natural patterns to be able to regenerate both the landscapes around us and then to regenerate the habitat we're living in. And so I'm working with different design professionals, which would include engineers, architects, urban planners, landscape architects, land use planners. I mean, all these kinds of folks at scale. And we've been bringing online slowly these classes, and these classes are incredibly intensive. I've had people come and tell me that they're very transformative. And interestingly enough, this comes back to the whole college thing. I've now had 7 different people tell me that one of our 2-week intensives taught them more than they got in their entire undergraduate degree. And what I told them in response to that, by the way, was, I don't care how good a teacher is, they shouldn't be able to teach you more in 2 weeks than a university can teach you in 4 years. So just another indication of how much universities are failing. But anyway, back to the point. We are rolling out a bunch of different classes aimed at different designers, agroecology professional, community professionals, and even the economic side, because we are working with what's called I call an ecosystemic economic model. Comes back to some stuff we talked about earlier. We're really working on those courses. The first one in that whole thing is called the process of regeneration, and it starts with a lot of the things we just talked about and goes deeper. So we are redoing our website right now. We haven't put all these classes up yet. We've been teaching them in venues where it was very controlled for quality control. I don't put a class out to the public until we feel like it is super solid. And so we're just now getting to the point where we're starting to put certain classes out to the public. And hopefully by the end of the year, 2023, we'll kind of have the website up for the Institute of Integrated Regenerative Design. There's a little bit there right now, but it's kind of, just a little bit. And it is the letter I, number 2, rd.co, i2rd.co. And then, we are going to start our newsletter here pretty soon, as soon as we kind of get the website updated. And then we'll start to talk about these classes that we will be doing. And hopefully they will be what a lot of our people who've been talking to us from all over the world are asking for, which is a way of reframing a lot of the powerful tools that they have to put them in service of regenerating our communities and regenerating our, the living world in which we exist.
Well, fantastic. Best of luck with all of that. Whenever you have anything that's ready to be announced to the world, just let me know. Certainly be more than happy and to help share that and spread the word. So thank you for your time today. Lots to think about, and I hope we can do this again.
Indeed.